Good evening all and welcome back to Mr. Chill Chapter. Tonight we are journeying to the frozen wilderness of Alaska with 10 true most disturbing Alaskan horror stories. These testimonies come from emergency dispatchers, researchers, seasonal workers, and pilots who encountered something in the last frontier that defies all explanation. Each account represents a documented nightmare pulled from Alaska's most isolated territories where the extreme cold preserves more than just bodies and the endless darkness conceals unspeakable truths. These stories have been gathered from official reports, personal journals, and recorded transmissions that were never meant to see the light of day. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will chill you to your very core. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the Arctic winds carry whispers of terror. Now let us venture into the heart of Alaska's most disturbing mysteries, where the frontier ends and your worst nightmares come alive in temperatures that can kill you in minutes. 3 years ago, I was working dispatch for Alaska State Troopers when we got a call that still haunts me to this day. My name is Marcus, and I have been handling emergency communications in Anchorage for over 15 years. I have heard everything you can imagine. Domestic disputes, car accidents and blizzards, missing hikers, bear attacks, overdoses. Nothing prepared me for what happened during my night shift on February 14th, 2022. It was one of those brutal Alaskan winters where the temperature had not climbed above 30 for 2 weeks straight. The kind of cold that makes your teeth ache and turns your breath into ice crystals before it leaves your mouth. Most people had the sense to stay indoors, so our call volume was unusually low that night. Just the occasional wellness check or domestic disturbance from folks going stir-crazy in their cabins. Around 2:47 a.m., my console lit up with an incoming emergency call. The caller ID showed a number I did not recognize, but that was not unusual. People called from borrowed phones, payaneses, or old landlines all the time. What was unusual was the quality of the connection. Most calls from remote areas came through with static dropped signals or that hollow satellite delay. This one was crystal clear, like the person was calling from the office next door. Alaska State Troopers, this is Marcus. What is your emergency? The voice that answered was male, middle-aged, with a slight Russian accent. He spoke slowly and deliberately, like he was choosing each word with great care. My name is Dmitry Volov. I'm calling to report my own death. I paused for a moment, thinking this was some kind of prank call or maybe someone having a mental health crisis. We got those sometimes, especially during the dark winter months when seasonal depression hit people hard. Sir, can you repeat that? Are you saying you're injured or in danger? No. No, I'm not. No, I'm injured. I am dead. I died 3 days ago in my cabin near Titna. My body is still there. Someone needs to come collect it before the wolves do. Now I was taking this seriously. Even if this was a mental health situation, I needed to get units to check on this person. I started typing notes into our system while keeping him on the line. Okay, Dmitry, I need you to give me your exact location so we can send someone to help you. Mile marker 47 on the Parks Highway. Then 12 min east on the old mining road, the cabin with the blue metal roof. You cannot miss it. The smoke stopped coming from the chimney 3 days ago. I was running his name through our database while he spoke. Dmitry Volov came up immediately. 73 years old, lived alone, no next of kin on file. More importantly, there was already a welfare check request filed by his neighbor 2 days ago. The neighbor had not seen smoke from Dmitry's chimney in several days and was worried because Dmitry never let his fire die during winter. Dmitry, we actually have a welfare check request for you. Your neighbor was concerned. Are you at your cabin right now? I'm at my cabin. Yes, but I'm not alive. I had a heart attack while splitting firewood behind the house. I fell face down in the snow. The cold preserved my body, but my heart stopped beating 72 hours ago. The hair on my arms was standing up. His voice was so calm, so matter-of-fact. There was no emotion, no panic, no confusion, just a dead man reporting his own death like he was calling in a noise complaint. Dmitri, if you are speaking to me right now, then you are alive. Heart attack victims can survive and recover. You might be confused or disoriented. I am sending paramedics to check on you right away. You do not understand. I watched my own body die. I have been watching it for 3 days. The ravens found it this morning. They started with the eyes. I felt ice water in my veins. I had been a dispatcher for 15 years and never had a conversation like this. I kept him talking while coordinating with units in the field. The closest patrol was 40 minutes away due to road conditions. Dmitri, I need you to stay on the line with me. Can you look around and tell me what you see? I can see my body lying behind the cabin. The axe is still in my right hand. My face is purple and frozen. There's no breathing, no pulse. The snow around my head is stained red from where I hit the ground. My neighbor's dog came by yesterday and sniffed around but would not come close. Animals know death. But if you can see your body, where are you calling from? I am standing in my kitchen looking out the window. The phone is in my hand. I can see you will not believe me until you see for yourself. That is why I'm calling. Someone needs to know what happened before I cannot call anymore. What do you mean you cannot call anymore? Each day I become more distant. Yesterday I could still feel the cold. Today I cannot. Tomorrow I do not think I will remember how to use the Abambi's phone. This is my last chance to report this properly. I was getting real-time updates from the patrol unit. They were making good time despite the conditions, but still 25 minutes out. I kept Dmitri talking partly for protocol and partly because I was genuinely disturbed by the clarity and consistency of his story. Dmitri, have you taken any medications recently? Any changes to your routine? No medications. I live simply, chop wood, maintain the cabin, read books. I was splitting kindling for the evening fire when the pain hit my chest. I dropped the axe and fell forward. I remember the cold snow on my face, then nothing. Then I was standing in the kitchen watching my own body. Are there any other people around? Anyone who might be playing a trick? There is no one for 12 miles. The mining road is not plowed. No one comes here in winter except the mail plane once a month, and that was last week. The patrol unit radioed in. They had reached mile marker 47 and were turning onto the mining road. I told them to approach with caution and be prepared for anything. Dmitri, the officers are almost there. They are going to help you. They will find my body behind the cabin. Tell them to look for the blue metal roof. Tell them I am sorry for the inconvenience. You do not need to apologize. We are here to help. You cannot help the dead, but you can make sure my body is treated with respect. I lived in Alaska for 37 years. I earned the right to a proper burial. The patrol unit radioed in again. They had found the cabin with the blue metal roof. No lights on, no smoke from the chimney. They were approaching on foot. Then I heard Officer Martinez's voice over the radio, strained and urgent. Dispatch, we have a body behind the cabin. Male, elderly, deceased for several days by the look of it. Definitely a cardiac event. We need the coroner out here. I looked at my phone. The call was still connected. The line was still active. Dmitri, are you still there? Silence. Dmitri, can you hear me? More silence than a sound that made my blood freeze. It was breathing, but not human breathing. It was the sound of air moving through a collapsed windpipe, wet and rattling. Then the line went dead. Officer Martinez radioed in with more details. The body was frozen solid, had been dead for at least 3 days. No signs of foul play, clear cardiac event while splitting wood. The axe was still gripped in the deceased's right hand. Most importantly, there was no power to the cabin. The generator had run out of fuel days ago. The phone line had been disconnected since last winter when a tree fell across the wires. I stared at my console. The call had lasted 37 minutes. I had 47 screens of notes. The phone number that had called in was disconnected and had been for almost a year. I never reported the details of that conversation. Who would believe me? Instead, I wrote in my log that we received an anonymous tip about a welfare check. But I kept those 47 screens of notes, and I still have them today. 6 months later, I transferred to a different department. I could not take another night shift after that. But sometimes when I'm driving past Taletna, I think about Dmitry Vulov and wonder how many other voices are calling from phones that do not work, reporting deaths that have already happened, asking for help that can never come. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest. The coroner estimated he had been dead for 3 days when we found him. But I know Dmitry Vulov was trying to do the right thing even after death. He called to report his own passing because that is what a responsible citizen does. The phone company has no record of any calls from that number on February 14, 2022. According to them, it is impossible, but I heard his voice for 37 minutes, and I have the notes to prove it. My colleague Isabella was a wildlife photographer who had been documenting Alaska's remote regions for National Geographic for over 8 years. I met her in 2019 when I was working as a field guide for researchers and photographers who needed someone familiar with Alaska's backcountry. Isabella Martinez was different from most of the photographers I worked with. She had this obsessive attention to detail and an almost supernatural ability to capture images that other photographers missed. Isabella specialized in photographing Alaska during the harshest conditions. While most wildlife photographers preferred the comfortable summer months, she thrived in winter. She said the cold brought out the truth in everything, the landscape, the animals, even the light itself. Her portfolio was filled with haunting images of wolves moving through blizzards, caribou migrations across frozen tundra, and the northern lights reflecting off glacial ice. In December 2021, Isabella approached me about a solo expedition she was planning to the Wrangell Mountains. She wanted to photograph a specific phenomenon that occurred only during the deepest part of winter, something she called ice ghosts. These were formations that appeared when moisture in the air crystallized around certain objects during extreme cold snaps, creating what looked like frozen apparitions. The location she had chosen was an abandoned mining camp about 60 miles northeast of McCarthy. The camp had been deserted since the 1940s, but Isabella had studied historical weather data and determined it was the perfect spot to capture her ice ghosts. She had rented a cabin from a local outfitter and planned to spend 2 weeks alone with her equipment. I advised against the solo trip. The area was incredibly remote. Temperatures regularly dropped to 50 and cell phone coverage was non-existent. But Isabella was determined. She had done solo expeditions before and considered herself more than capable. She showed me her gear, professional cold weather photography equipment, emergency beacon, enough supplies for 3 weeks, and a satellite communicator for daily check-ins. We agreed that she would send me a brief message every evening at 8 p.m. via satellite communicator. If I did not hear from her for more than 24 hours, I would contact search and rescue. She flew out on December 15th with a bush pilot named Tom, who dropped her at the cabin along with all her equipment. The first 3 days went according to plan. Her messages were brief but enthusiastic. Day 1 arrived safely. Cabin is solid, temperature 32, incredible conditions for shooting. Day 2 got some amazing shots of ice formations around the old mining equipment. The light here is otherworldly. Day 3 found something interesting near the mine entrance. Ice formations unlike anything I have seen before. Staying an extra day to document. Day 4 was when things started to change. Her message came late around 11 p.m. instead of 8 p.m. The formations are moving. I know that sounds impossible, but I have time-lapse footage that proves it. They shift position when I am not looking directly at them. I was concerned, but not alarmed. Isabella was a professional and had never shown signs of paranoia or delusion. Cold and isolation could affect people in strange ways, but she had only been out there 4 days. Day 5. I was wrong about them being ice formations. They are not made of ice. I do not know what they are made of, but they are not natural. They appear in my photographs even when I cannot see them with my eyes. Now I was getting worried. I sent back a message asking if she wanted to be picked up early, but she did not respond. Day 6. They know I am photographing them. When I review my images, there are more of them in each shot. They are multiplying or getting closer. I cannot tell which. Day 7. I found photos on my camera that I did not take. The timestamps show they were taken while I was sleeping. Someone or something is using my equipment. I immediately contacted Tom the pilot and asked him to do a flyover of the cabin. Weather conditions were deteriorating, but he agreed to check on Isabella when the storm passed. Day 8. The photos taken while I slept show the inside of the cabin. They show me sleeping in my bunk, but they also show shapes standing around the bed. I cannot see these shapes with my eyes, only through the camera lens. Day 9. I understand now. The camera sees what is really here. The ice ghosts are not ice, and they are not ghosts. They are something else entirely, something that exists in a spectrum of light human eyes cannot perceive. Tom was finally able to fly over on day 10. He reported that the cabin looked normal from the air. Smoke coming from the chimney, Isabella's gear visible outside, no signs of distress, but the weather was too rough for landing. Day 10. I have been reviewing all my photos from the trip. The shapes appear in every single image, even ones taken on the first day. They were here before I arrived. I think they have always been here. Day 11. Last night I left the camera running with a motion trigger. This morning there were 847 new photos, all taken between midnight and 6 a.m., all showing the same thing. Dozens of tall, thin figures surrounding the cabin. Some appear to be looking through windows. Others seem to be examining my equipment. I was preparing to organize a rescue operation when her day 12 message came through. I finally understand what they want. They want to be seen. They want to be documented. For decades, maybe centuries, they have been here invisible to human eyes. I am the first person to bring equipment sensitive enough to capture them. Day 13. They are not hostile. They are curious. When I hold up photos of them, they seem to examine the images. I think they have never seen themselves before. I'm giving them what they have always wanted, proof that they exist. Her final message came on day 14. I am staying longer than planned. This is the most important work I have ever done. These beings deserve to be documented properly. Tom does not need to pick me up yet. I will contact you when I am ready. That was the last communication I received from Isabella. When she did not check in on day 15, I contacted Search and Rescue. It took another 2 days to organize a team due to weather conditions. When we finally reached the cabin on day 17, we found Isabella sitting at the small wooden table, surrounded by printed photographs covering every surface. She was alive, but in a catatonic state, staring at the images spread before her. Her camera equipment was still running automatically, taking photos every few minutes. The photographs were the most disturbing thing I have ever seen. They showed the cabin interior filled with tall, impossibly thin humanoid figures. The beings appeared to be made of the same crystalline material as Isabella's ice ghosts, but they were clearly animate and intelligent. In some photos, they were touching Isabella's equipment. In others, they appeared to be communicating with each other. A few showed them standing directly beside Isabella as she worked, close enough to touch. The most unsettling photos were the recent ones. They showed Isabella sitting at the table, but she was not alone. The figures surrounded her, and in some images they appeared to be touching her head and shoulders. As we scrolled through the chronological sequence, we could see Isabella's posture gradually changing, becoming more rigid and unnatural. The medical team said Isabella was suffering from severe hypothermia and dehydration, but that did not explain her condition. Her core body temperature was impossibly low, too low for survival. Yet she was alive. Her pulse was faint and irregular, beating only 12 times per minute instead of the normal 60 to 100. We evacuated Isabella to Anchorage General Hospital, where she remained in the same catatonic state for 6 weeks. She would not speak, would not eat, and barely responded to stimuli. Her body temperature remained abnormally low despite all medical interventions. When she finally spoke, her first words were, "They are still here. They followed me." Isabella claimed that the beings from her photographs had attached themselves to her somehow. She said she could see them constantly now without the aid of a camera. They stood in hospital corridors in her room, sometimes touching the medical equipment. She insisted they were not harmful, just intensely curious about human civilization. The doctors diagnosed her with severe PTSD and cold-induced psychosis. But I saw those photographs, and I saw how her equipment continued taking pictures of empty spaces that were not empty. Isabella never recovered fully. She was released from the hospital after 3 months, but she was never the same person. She became obsessed with photographing ordinary locations, parking lots, office buildings, shopping centers, claiming she was documenting the others as they explored human environments. Her final exhibition before she disappeared was called The Invisible Migration. It consisted of hundreds of photographs of everyday locations around Anchorage, all showing the same tall, crystalline figures moving through our world. The beings appeared in every photo, examining cars, standing in doorways, observing people who could not see them. Isabella vanished in September 2022. Her apartment was found empty except for camera equipment and thousands of photographs. The final images on her camera showed her own bedroom, but she was not in the shots. Instead, the crystalline beings filled the frame, and they appeared to be looking directly at the camera as if posing for a group portrait. The police classified it as a missing person case, but I think Isabella finally went where she belonged, somewhere between the visible world and whatever spectrum of light those beings inhabit. I kept one of her photographs. It shows the interior of a normal coffee shop in downtown Anchorage, but if you look carefully, you can see them standing among the customers, tall, thin, watching everything with an intelligence that makes your skin crawl. Sometimes I wonder if bringing that photograph home was a mistake, 'cause lately in my peripheral vision I swear I can see shapes that should not be there. Every summer, thousands of workers migrate to Alaska's fishing industry. Rashid thought it would be easy money. 6 months of hard work in exchange for enough cash to pay off his student loans and maybe start fresh somewhere else. The recruitment poster at the Seattle Job Center had made it sound almost glamorous. Work in America's last frontier. Excellent pay, housing provided. What they did not tell him was that the Cannery sat on a remote island 40 kilometers from the nearest town, accessible only by boat or helicopter. What they definitely did not mention was that some workers who went to Fish Point Cannery never came back. Rashid Hassan was 24 years old, fresh out of college with a degree in engineering that had not landed him anything better than part-time work at an auto parts store. When the Cannery recruiter promised $12 an hour plus overtime, more money than Rashid had ever made, he signed the 6-month contract without reading the fine print. He was supposed to fly to Kodiak Island, then take a company boat to the Cannery for orientation on June 1st, 2020. The first red flag should have been the boat ride. The captain, a weathered man named Murphy, barely spoke during the 2-hour journey to Fish Point. When Rashid tried to make conversation about the work, Murphy just shook his head and said, "You'll see soon enough." The only other passengers were three experienced cannery workers returning from shore leave, and they spent the entire trip drinking from a bottle they passed between them, occasionally glancing at Rashid with what looked like pity. Fish Point Cannery was bigger than Rashid had expected, a sprawling complex of industrial buildings, storage facilities, and dormitories clustered around a natural harbor. The main processing plant was a massive corrugated metal structure that seemed to vibrate with mechanical noise even from a distance. Smokestacks belched steam into the gray sky, and the air carried the overwhelming smell of fish, diesel fuel, and something else Rashid could not identify, something sweet and rotten. The dormitory where Rashid was assigned was a long, narrow building filled with bunk beds arranged in rows. Each worker got a bottom or top bunk, a small metal locker, and nothing else. The mattresses were thin and stained, and the entire building smelled like industrial disinfectant mixed with body odor. Rashid's bunkmate was a Filipino man named Eduardo, who had worked at Fish Point for 5 summers. "First time?" Eduardo asked as Rashid unpacked his belongings. "Yeah, you?" Eduardo laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I keep coming back because the money is good, but every year I tell myself it will be my last." He lowered his voice. "This place changes people. Changes them in ways that do not wash off when you go home." Before Rashid could ask what he meant, the dinner bell rang, a harsh electric buzzer that echoed through the complex. Eduardo explained that all meals were served in the masal at specific times, and missing a meal meant going hungry until the next scheduled feeding. The masal was a cavernous room filled with long tables and benches like a prison cafeteria. The food was institutional: overcooked vegetables, processed meat, and bread that tasted like cardboard. But Rashid was hungry from the journey and ate everything on his tray. He noticed that many of the workers ate mechanically, staring straight ahead, barely speaking to each other. "How many people work here?" Rashid asked Eduardo. "Hard to say. The count changes." Eduardo gestured around the room. "See that table in the corner? Those are the guys who work the night shift in Processing Unit C. They do not talk to anyone during the day, sleep during their breaks. Some of them have been here 3-4 seasons and never said a word to me." Rashid followed Eduardo's gaze to a table where 6 men sat in complete silence, eating their food with robotic efficiency. Their clothes were stained with what looked like fish blood, but the stains were dark brown, almost black. When one of them looked up, Rashid saw that the man's eyes were completely bloodshot, like he had not slept in weeks. "What do they do in Processing Unit C?" "Special projects," Eduardo said quietly. "Company pays them double, but they have to sign extra paperwork. Non-disclosure agreements, some kind of experimental processing technique they are developing." The orientation meeting was held in a small conference room after dinner. The plant manager, a thin man named Stevens, explained the basic safety protocols and work schedules. Most workers would be assigned to the main processing line where they would clean, cut, and package salmon for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The 7th day was technically a rest day, but voluntary overtime was available for those who wanted extra money. Stevens also explained the company's strict policies about leaving the island. Workers were not permitted to take boats or helicopters without authorization, and unauthorized attempts to leave would result in immediate termination and forfeit of all wages. The company boat ran to Kodiak twice a month for supply runs, and workers could request passage for medical emergencies only. "Are there any questions?" Stevens asked. A young woman near the front raised her hand. "What about communication with families? Cell phone service? No cell towers out here." Stevens said, "We have a satellite phone in the office for emergencies, but personal calls are limited to 5 minutes once per week." Company policy. Rashid felt a chill. He had not realized how completely isolated they would be. 6 months without regular contact with the outside world suddenly seemed much longer. Work began at 4 a.m. The next morning, Rashid was assigned to the gutting station where his job was to remove the internal organs from salmon as they moved down a conveyor belt. The fish came from the boats pre-sorted by size, but they still had to be cleaned, gutted, and prepared for the next stage of processing. The work was exactly as horrible as it sounded. Standing for 12 hours while performing the same motions hundreds of times covered in fish blood and slime, surrounded by the constant noise of machinery. The smell was overwhelming, not just fish, but the chemical cleaners used to sanitize the equipment and something else. That same sweet, rotting odor he had noticed when he first arrived. After 3 days, Rashid's hands were raw despite the rubber gloves and his back ached constantly. But the worst part was the other workers. Many of them seemed to exist in a kind of trance, performing their jobs with mechanical precision but showing no awareness of their surroundings. They rarely spoke except to call out problems with the machinery, and they never made eye contact. "How long have some of these people been working here?" Rashid asked Eduardo during their lunch break. "Some of them years. The company offers bonuses to workers who sign multi-year contracts, but after a while Eduardo trailed off." "After a while, what? Look at Martinez over there." Eduardo nodded toward a man working at the cleaning station. "He has been here 4 years. Watch how he moves." Rashid observed Martinez for several minutes. The man worked with incredible efficiency, his hands moving in perfect rhythm, never wasting a motion. But there was something unsettling about it. He never looked up, never paused, never seemed to breathe hard despite the physical demands of the work. "It is like he is not really here," Rashid said. "Exactly. The company calls it optimal workforce integration. They say the best workers eventually achieve a state where the job becomes automatic, instinctive. They can work longer shifts, need fewer breaks, make fewer mistakes. That does not sound normal. Nothing about this place is normal, but the company pays well and people need the money." On his 10th day, Rashid was reassigned to help with a special project in Processing Unit C. Stevens explained that they needed extra hands for an experimental procedure that was being tested during the night shift. The pay would be double his regular wage, but he would have to sign additional confidentiality agreements. The paperwork was extensive, pages of legal language about trade secrets, proprietary techniques, and severe penalties for discussing company operations with unauthorized personnel. Rashid almost refused, but the extra money was too tempting. He signed everything without reading it carefully. Processing Unit C was in a separate building connected to the main plant by a covered walkway. The interior was different from the main processing floor, cleaner, more modern, with equipment that looked like it belonged in a laboratory rather than a fish cannery. The lighting was harsh white fluorescence that made everything look sterile and unnatural. The night shift supervisor, a woman named Dr. Reeves, explained that they were testing a new preservation technique that required precise timing and temperature control. The work involved injecting salmon with a special solution before processing, then monitoring the fish during various stages of treatment. "What kind of solution?" Rashid asked. "Proprietary formulation," Dr. Reeves replied. "Company developed it to extend shelf life and improve texture. Very promising results so far." The solution was stored in large stainless steel tanks and delivered through a complex system of hoses and injection devices. It was clear like water, but had a chemical smell that reminded Rashid of formaldehyde. The workers who handled the injection process wore full hazmat suits with respirators, which seemed excessive for a food preservation treatment. But the strangest part was what happened to the fish after injection. Within minutes, their color changed from the normal silver pink of salmon to a gray-white that looked almost translucent. The flesh became firmer, almost rubbery, and took on an oily sheen. Dr. Reeves insisted this was normal, and that the final product would be processed further to restore normal appearance. During his third night in Processing Unit C, Rashid made a discovery that changed everything. He was working alone in the storage area, organizing treated fish for the next processing stage, when he noticed that some of the containers were labeled with dates from previous years. Not just months, but years. Fish that had been treated with the solution in 2018, 2019, even earlier. Curious, he opened one of the older containers. The fish inside looked exactly the same as the ones processed that night. The same gray-white color, the same rubbery texture, the same oily sheen. After 2 years of storage, they showed no signs of decay, no smell of spoilage, nothing that suggested normal decomposition. But that was not the most disturbing part. When Rashid lifted one of the 2-year-old fish, it felt warm to the touch. Not room temperature warm, but body temperature warm. And when he looked closely, he could swear he saw the gills moving slightly, like the fish was still breathing. He dropped the fish back in the container and stepped away, his heart racing, but he could not stop looking. All of the fish in the older containers seemed to be moving slightly, not swimming, but shifting position like they were trying to get comfortable. And the oldest container, labeled 2017, contained fish that had developed something that looked like a network of thin white threads running through their flesh. Dr. Reeves found him there 20 minutes later. "Problem with the inventory?" she asked. "Some of these are really old," Rashid said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Are they still good?" "The solution prevents normal decomposition. These fish could remain fresh indefinitely under proper conditions." She moved closer to him. "But you should not be handling the older samples without proper equipment. The preservation compound becomes more concentrated over time. What exactly is in that solution?" Dr. Reeves studied him for a long moment. "I think it is time you met with Mr. Stevens about a permanent position here. You show real aptitude for this work." The next day, Rashid was called to Stevens' office for what was described as a career development meeting. Stevens explained that Fish Point Cannery was actually a research facility testing advanced food preservation techniques for government and military contracts. The salmon operation was a cover for work that was classified at the highest levels. "We need dedicated personnel who can maintain absolute secrecy about our operations," Stevens said. "In exchange, we offer exceptional compensation and the opportunity to be part of groundbreaking scientific research." Rashid asked what would happen if he declined the permanent position. Stevens smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "No one declines. Once you have seen what you have seen, you become part of the family here. We take care of our family, but we also expect loyalty." That night, Rashid tried to leave. He made it as far as the harbor before Murphy and 2 other men found him. They explained gently but firmly that leaving without authorization was not an option. They escorted him back to the dormitory where Eduardo was waiting. "I tried to warn you," Eduardo said, "but you had to see for yourself." "How long have you really been here?" Rashid asked. 7 years. I stopped counting after the 5th year. Eduardo sat down heavily on his bunk. "The preservation solution does not just work on fish." Rashid felt his blood turn to ice water. "What do you mean?" "The workers who have been here longest, the ones in the special processing units, they inject themselves with diluted versions of the compound. It keeps them healthy, prevents aging, eliminates the need for sleep. But it also changes them, makes them less human and more like machines." "That is impossible. Look at your hands." Richard looked down. His hands, which had been raw and bleeding from the work, were completely healed. The skin looked better than it had before he started working at the cannery. In fact, he realized he had been feeling stronger and more energetic despite working 12-hour shifts. They have been putting it in the food, Eduardo continued. Small doses at first, just enough to improve worker performance and reduce sick days, but once it is in your system, you need more and more until eventually you cannot survive without it. The truth hit Rashid like a physical blow. The workers who never spoke, who worked with mechanical precision, who never seemed tired or hungry, they were not human anymore. They were something in between human and the preserved fish in Processing Unit C. "Why do you stay?" Rashid whispered. "Because if I try to leave, I will die. The compound creates a dependency. Without regular doses, my organs will shut down within days. I am trapped here until I become like the others. A perfect worker who never questions, never complains, never remembers what life was like before." Rashid spent his remaining weeks at Fish Point Cannery documenting everything he could remember about the operations, the workers, and the preservation compound. He wrote detailed notes and hid them in his belongings, hoping someone would eventually find them. But as the weeks passed, he found it harder to care about escape. The work became easier, more natural. He needed less sleep, felt less pain, thought less about home. The compound was doing its job, slowly transforming him into the ideal worker. The last entry in his hidden notes, written in handwriting that was becoming more mechanical and uniform, read, "Week 23. I understand now why no one leaves. This is not imprisonment. This is evolution. We are becoming something better than human. Something that can work forever without fatigue, without complaint, without the weakness of emotion or desire. The company is not just preserving fish, they are preserving us. And preservation is just another word for immortality." The official records show that Rashid Hassan completed his 6-month contract at Fish Point Cannery and signed on for a permanent position. He has been there for 5 years now, working the night shift in Processing Unit C. He never takes vacation time, never calls home, and according to co-workers, never seems to age. The compound is now being tested at canneries throughout Alaska with plans for expansion to processing facilities across the country. The government is very interested in a workforce that never gets sick, never strikes, and never quits. They call it the future of American labor. But if you ever get offered a job at a remote fish processing facility, especially one that requires you to sign extensive confidentiality agreements, I suggest you remember Rashid Hassan and the workers who became something more than human and something much less. 'Cause some jobs change you in ways that can never be undone. Kenji was the kind of pilot everyone trusted with their lives. 20 years flying Alaska's most dangerous routes without incident, delivering supplies to remote villages, conducting search and rescue operations, and transporting researchers to locations where even helicopters could not land safely. His reputation was built on precision, caution, and an almost supernatural ability to read weather conditions that could change from flyable to lethal in minutes. I knew Kenji personally because I worked as a flight dispatcher for Arctic Airways out of Fairbanks. Part of my job was coordinating flight plans, monitoring weather reports, and maintaining radio contact with our pilots during their routes. In 20 years of dispatching, I had never worried about Kenji Nakamura. He was the pilot other pilots called when conditions were too dangerous for anyone else. Kenji flew a modified Cessna 180 that he had personally maintained and upgraded over 15 years. He knew every bolt, wire, and instrument in that aircraft better than most people know their own cars. The plane was equipped with the latest GPS navigation, emergency locator beacon, satellite communication system, and enough survival gear to last 2 weeks in the wilderness. If any pilot could handle an emergency in Alaska's backcountry, it was Kenji. On March 8, 2023, Kenji was contracted for what should have been a routine charter flight. A geological survey team needed transportation from Fairbanks to a remote location near Lake Clark National Park, approximately 280 meters southwest. The passengers were Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a geologist from the University of Alaska, and her graduate assistant, Mark Stevens. They were conducting research on volcanic activity in the area and had booked a round trip with overnight camping. The weather forecast was favorable: clear skies, light winds, visibility unlimited. I approved the flight plan, without hesitation. Kenji's route would take him southwest from Fairbanks, following the Alaska Range, then turning south toward Lake Clark. Total flight time was estimated at 2 hours and 15 minutes each way. Kenji departed Fairbanks at 8:30 a.m., with his 2 passengers and their geological equipment. His first radio check came at 9:15 a.m. as scheduled. He reported normal flight conditions on course, no issues with aircraft systems. Dr. Mitchell could be heard in the background commenting on the spectacular mountain views. The second radio check at 10:09 a.m. was equally routine. Kenji reported passing the halfway point, aircraft performing normally, passengers doing well. He estimated arrival at the landing site at 10:45 a.m. as planned. At 10:30 a.m. I received Kenji's final scheduled radio transmission before landing, but something about it made me pay closer attention than usual. Fairbanks Dispatch, this is November 27th, Echo Kilo. We are approximately 15 minutes from landing site. Aircraft systems normal, but I am seeing some unusual activity on the ground below. Copy Echo Kilo. What kind of activity? Large group of animals moving in formation, too organized to be natural. Could be a caribou herd. But the pattern is strange, almost like they are being directed by something. Roger. Are you having any difficulty with navigation or aircraft systems? Negative. All systems green. GPS shows us on course. It is just the animal behavior is unusual. I have never seen wildlife move in such precise formations. Copy that. Contact me when you are safely on the ground, will do. Echo Kilo out. That was the last transmission anyone received from Kenji Nakamura. When he failed to check in by 11:30 a.m., I began standard overdue aircraft procedures. I contacted the geological team's emergency contact and verified they had not received any communication. Weather conditions remained clear throughout the flight area, and no other aircraft reported seeing Kenji's plane. By 2:00 p.m., we had launched a full search and rescue operation. 2 helicopters and 3 fixed-wing aircraft began searching the projected flight path, focusing on the area around the intended landing site. The search continued until darkness, covering over 500 square miles of wilderness. The search resumed the next morning with additional aircraft and a ground team. The emergency locator beacon in Kenji's plane should have activated automatically in the event of a crash, but we were receiving no signal. GPS tracking showed his last known position, but extensive searching of that area revealed nothing. On the 3rd day, one of the search helicopters spotted wreckage in a valley approximately 12 mi from Kenji's intended destination. The location was accessible only by helicopter due to steep terrain and dense forest. The crash site appeared to be a small clearing surrounded by tall spruce trees. The recovery team found the remains of Kenji Cessna 180, but the crash scene raised more questions than it answered. The aircraft had impacted the ground nose first at what appeared to be a steep angle, suggesting a controlled descent rather than an out-of-control crash. The wreckage was concentrated in a relatively small area, indicating the plane had not broken apart in flight, but several aspects of the crash defied explanation. First, there was no debris trail leading to the impact site. When aircraft crash in mountainous terrain, they typically leave a path of scattered parts as they hit trees and rocks during the descent. Kenji's plane appeared to have dropped straight down into the clearing like it had fallen from directly overhead. Second, the emergency locator beacon was found intact and functional, but it had never activated. The device was designed to trigger automatically upon impact, yet it remained silent throughout the search operation. When tested, it worked perfectly. Most disturbing was the condition of the aircraft's instruments. The GPS unit showed Kenji's last recorded position as being 47 degree miles north of the actual crash site. The altimeter read 12,000 FT, though the crash site was at 3,200 FT elevation. The fuel gauges indicated full tanks despite the fact that Kenji should have burned at least half his fuel by the time of the crash. The bodies of all 3 occupants were recovered, but their condition raised additional questions. Kenji was found still strapped in the pilot's seat, his hands on the controls, looking as though he had been trying to manage a controlled landing. Dr. Mitchell and Mark Stevens were found in their passenger seats, also properly secured with safety belts. The medical examiner determined that all 3 had died from injuries consistent with aircraft impact. But the toxicology reports revealed something unprecedented. All 3 victims had blood oxygen levels that were impossible for the altitude and circumstances of the crash. Their blood contained oxygen concentrations typical of someone breathing pure oxygen at sea level, not the thin air of Alaska's mountains. More troubling was the discovery of the flight data recorder. Kenji's plane was not required to carry such equipment, but he had installed a basic voice recorder for his own training purposes. When we retrieved and analyzed the recording, we found 90 minutes of normal flight conversation, followed by 17 minutes of audio that should not have existed. The recording captured Kenji's voice during the final approach to what he believed was his destination. But instead of the sounds of a pilot conducting a routine landing, the audio revealed a man in a state of complete confusion and growing panic. "Sarah, are you seeing this? The landing site has changed. There are structures down there that were not on the survey maps." Dr. Mitchell's voice responded, "What kind of structures? They look like buildings, but the architecture is wrong. Too tall, too narrow, and there are lights moving between them, but not electric lights." Something else. Mark Stevens could be heard in the background. "Kenji, maybe we should find an alternate landing site. I'm trying, but the GPS is malfunctioning. It shows us at our destination, but this is not the location we plan to land. The terrain is completely different." The recording continued with increasingly frantic attempts to establish their true location. Kenji reported that his instruments were providing contradictory information. His compass was spinning freely and the radio was receiving signals from stations that should have been out of range. But the most chilling part of the recording was what happened during the final minutes. Kenji's voice changed from confusion to terror as he described what he was seeing below. There are people on the ground, hundreds of them standing in perfect rows. They are looking up at us. All of them looking up at exactly the same angle, like they knew we were coming. "Dr. Mitchell, are they waving? Maybe they can help us." "No, they are not waving. They are just standing there perfectly still, all facing our direction. And Sarah, they do not look right. The proportions are wrong. Too tall, arms too long. This is not a human settlement." The recording captured the sound of Kenji attempting to change course, but his voice indicated the aircraft was not responding to control inputs. The engine sound remained steady, suggesting no mechanical failure, but Kenji reported that the plane was descending against his will. "I have full power. Controls are responding, but we are going down anyway. It is like something is pulling us toward the ground. The altimeter is climbing while we descend. This is impossible." In the final minutes, all 3 voices could be heard discussing the impossible nature of their situation. The instruments showed they were gaining altitude while visually they were clearly descending. The GPS indicated they were flying over flat tundra while they could see mountainous terrain below. Most disturbing, Kenji reported that the sun appeared to be setting in the north. The last clear transmission was Kenji's voice, strangely calm. "We are going to impact in approximately 30 seconds. I want to state for the record that none of our instruments are providing accurate information. We are not where we think we are. This is not when we think it is, and I do not believe we are going to crash where our bodies will be found." The recording ended with the sound of impact. The official investigation concluded that Kenji experienced spatial disorientation due to unexpected weather conditions, became confused about his location, and crashed while attempting to land in unsuitable terrain. The contradictory instrument readings were attributed to multiple equipment failures, though no explanation was provided for how so many independent systems could malfunction simultaneously. But the investigators could not explain several key pieces of evidence. The aircraft's maintenance log showed all instruments had been recently serviced and tested. Weather data confirmed clear conditions throughout the flight area. Most significantly, analysis of the wreckage showed no evidence of equipment failure. Every system appeared to be functioning normally at the time of impact. 6 months after the crash, I was contacted by a hiker who claimed to have found additional wreckage in a remote valley approximately 60 mi from the official crash site. He provided photographs of aircraft parts that appeared to match Kenji's Cessna, including a section of wing with a distinctive paint scheme Kenji had applied himself. I reported this to the authorities, but when a recovery team reached the location, they found nothing. The hiker insisted he had photographed aircraft wreckage, but the images on his camera showed only natural rock formations in fallen trees. The case was officially closed, but questions remain. How did Kenji's instruments record impossible readings while apparently functioning normally? Why was the emergency locator beacon silent during the crash but operational afterward? What was the source of the 17 minutes of audio that captured events the investigators insisted never happened? More disturbing is the fact that 3 other experienced pilots have reported similar instrument anomalies while flying over the same general area. 2 managed to land safely and reported their equipment returned to normal function once they changed course. The 3rd pilot radioed that his GPS was showing a destination that did not exist on any map, then was never heard from again. The Federal Aviation Administration has issued no special warnings about the area, but local pilots have begun avoiding the region where Kenji Nakamura disappeared. They call it the confusion zone, a place where instruments lie, directions become meaningless, and aircraft disappear into a landscape that exists somewhere between what is real and what should be impossible. I still have the flight data recording from Kenji's final flight. Sometimes late at night, I listen to those 17 minutes and wonder if Kenji was right. Maybe they did not crash where their bodies were found. Maybe they crashed somewhere else entirely, in a place that does not exist on our maps, but exists nonetheless. Because if experienced pilots like Kenji Nakamura can simply vanish into clear sky over familiar territory, then there are places in Alaska that are not part of the world we think we know. And some of those places are apparently interested in pilots who fly too close to secrets that should remain hidden. Ice fishing had been in a wife's Irish family for generations, but Alaska's frozen lakes held secrets her ancestors never encountered in the waters of County Cork. Io O'Brien had moved to Anchorage in 2018 after inheriting her grandfather's fishing equipment and a burning desire to test her skills against the legendary fish of the last frontier. What she discovered beneath the ice of Lake Shalatna was something that should have remained buried for another 1,000 years. I met Awif at Murphy's Bait and Tackle in Wasilla, where she was purchasing specialized cold weather gear for what she called serious ice fishing. Most tourists who came through the shop were looking for basic equipment and guided tours. But If was different. She knew exactly what she needed and asked technical questions about ice thickness, underwater topography, and fish behavior during extreme cold snaps that impressed even our most experienced local guides. Awif was a marine biologist by training, but she had grown up learning traditional Irish fishing techniques from her grandfather, Seamus O'Brien, who had spent 70 years fishing the lakes and rivers of Ireland. When Seamus passed away in 2017, he left Ofu his collection of hand-forged fishing tools, some of which dated back to the 1800s. These were not museum pieces, they were functional equipment that had been used by generations of O'Brien fishermen to catch species that commercial fishermen could not touch. My grandfather always said that fish were older than humans, O told me as she examined our selection of ice augers. He believed that if you knew how to listen to the water, really listen, the fish would tell you stories about what came before us. What made O's fishing different was her combination of ancient Irish techniques and modern scientific knowledge. She used traditional hand-forged hooks and lines made from materials that her grandfather had taught her to prepare. But she also carried underwater cameras, sonar equipment, and water testing kits. Her goal was to document the differences between traditional fishing methods and modern approaches. In January 2022, I decided to test her skills on Lake Chalatenna, a remote body of water about 60 miles northwest of Anchorage. The lake was known for excellent ice fishing, but it required a snowmobile or ATV to reach, and the access road was often impassable during winter storms. Most importantly for AOWIF's research, Lake Chalatenna was deep, over 400 ft in some areas, and connected to underground springs that kept portions of the lake from freezing completely even during the harshest winters. AOWIF had studied geological surveys of the area and identified a section of the lake where the bottom dropped off sharply from shallow fishing areas to depths that had never been properly mapped. Her theory was that traditional fishing methods might be more effective in these transitional zones where fish moved between different water temperatures and pressures. She made 3 trips to Lake Chalatenna during January and February, each time pushing further from shore toward the deeper sections. Her first 2 expeditions produced impressive catches using her grandfather's equipment, including lake trout larger than anything caught in the area for years. But it was her 3rd trip on February 18th that changed everything. AOWIF had positioned herself over what her sonar showed as a gradual slope leading to the deepest part of the lake. The ice was solid, nearly 3 ft thick, but her equipment detected open water far below, suggesting active springs feeding the lake from underground sources. She had set up her shelter and was preparing to fish when her underwater camera picked up something unusual. At first, she thought it was a large piece of submerged timber or debris. The camera showed a long, dark object resting on the lake bottom approximately 60 ft below the ice. But as they adjusted the camera angle and increased the lighting, she realized the object had too much geometric regularity to be natural. It appeared to be constructed from fitted stones like ancient masonry, forming what looked like a rectangular structure about 12 ft long and 4 ft wide. "That cannot be right," a wife muttered to herself as she recorded video of the structure. According to geological surveys, this area had been under glacial ice until relatively recently in geological terms. There should not be any human constructions on the lake bottom, especially something that appeared to be very old. Using her grandfather's traditional weighted line, AOWIF began fishing directly above the structure. The technique involved lowering a specially prepared hook very slowly while maintaining contact with the bottom through subtle movements of the line. It was a method that required years of practice to master, but it allowed experienced fishermen to feel the underwater environment in ways that modern equipment could not match. What AO felt through the line was wrong. Instead of the soft mud or rocky bottom she expected, the weighted line seemed to be resting on something hollow. When she moved the weight, it produced a sound that traveled up through the water and ice, a hollow tapping like striking an empty container. More disturbing was what happened when she began to pull the line up. Instead of the resistance of water and weight, she felt something tugging back, as if something below was trying to pull the line deeper. She had experienced large fish fighting against the hook, but this felt different, more deliberate, more intelligent. AOWIF managed to pull the line up about 20 ft before whatever was holding it let go suddenly, causing her to fall backward in her shelter. When she examined the line, she found that the traditional hook her grandfather had forged was missing. In its place was a piece of carved bone shaped into a hook. But the craftsmanship was unlike anything she had ever seen. The bone hook was covered in intricate symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. The material itself was unlike any bone AF recognized. It was almost translucent with a blue-green tint that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of her shelter. Most unsettling was the fact that the bone hook was attached to her line with a knot that she had not tied and could not identify despite years of studying traditional fishing techniques. Against her better judgment, Aif decided to continue fishing with the mysterious hook. She reasoned that, as a marine biologist, she had a scientific obligation to investigate unusual phenomena, and the bone hook was certainly that. She lowered the line again, this time using her underwater camera to monitor what happened below. The video footage from that day, which AOE later shared with me, shows something that challenges everything we think we know about what lives in Alaska's deep lakes. As the bone hook descended toward the stone structure, the water around it began to change. What had appeared to be empty water started to fill with shapes, long undulating forms that moved with purpose and intelligence. At first, a wife thought she was seeing eels or large fish attracted to the hook. But as the creatures came closer to the camera, their true nature became apparent. They were not fish at all, but something far older and more alien. The creatures had serpentine bodies covered in scales that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, making them appear as moving shadows in the water. Their heads were elongated and flattened with large eyes that reflected the camera's light like mirrors. But the most disturbing feature was their appendages. Along their bodies were what appeared to be arms or manipulator organs ending in hands with too many fingers. These hands were using tools, carved implements that they employed to construct or modify the stone structure on the lake bottom. The bone hook seemed to attract their attention immediately. Several creatures approached it, examining it with obvious intelligence and interest. Then one of them took hold of the hook and impossibly began to communicate through the fishing line itself. Oi felt the communication as vibrations traveling up through the water and line. Not random movements, but patterns that clearly represented language or complex information transfer. The vibrations formed rhythms and sequences that reminded her of Morse code, but far more sophisticated and nuanced. As she tried to understand what was happening, the creatures below began to feed information through the line. The vibrations formed images in Aof's mind, not visual images, but conceptual understanding that bypassed normal sensory processing. She began to comprehend that the stone structure was not a building or monument, but a kind of preservation chamber. The creatures, which she came to understand, were called the Sluhag Mara. In her grandfather's language, the sea host had been guardians of the lake for thousands of years. They had built the stone chamber to preserve something that had been entrusted to their care before the last ice age, something that surface dwellers were never meant to discover. Through the bone hook connection, O learned that her grandfather's fishing methods were not simply traditional techniques passed down through generations. They were remnants of an ancient pact between certain human families and the Sluhag Mara. The specially forged hooks and traditional methods were designed to communicate respectfully with the underwater guardians, not to catch ordinary fish. But the pact had been broken when Aya's grandfather died without properly passing on the full knowledge to his descendants. Awe had been using the tools correctly, but without understanding their true purpose. She had inadvertently opened a communication channel that should have remained closed. The creatures showed her through the continuing vibrations what lay within the stone chamber. It was a collection of objects and specimens from the world that existed before the ice. Artifacts from human civilizations that had achieved levels of knowledge and technology that current humanity was not ready to rediscover. The chamber contained biological samples, technological devices, and written records from societies that had learned to work in harmony with non-human intelligences. The Slue Agmara had been charged with keeping this knowledge safe until humanity evolved enough to use it responsibly. But recent changes in the environment, pollution, climate change, and increased human activity in remote areas were threatening the stability of their preservation sites throughout Alaska. As the communication continued, O began to understand that she had been chosen not by chance, but because her bloodline carried the genetic markers necessary to interpret the information being shared. Her grandfather had known this but had died before he could complete her training. Now the Slue Mara were forced to accelerate her education because time was running out. The bone hook began to feel warm in the water and the vibrations intensified. Ala found herself receiving detailed instructions for locating other preservation sites throughout Alaska, along with warnings about what would happen if these sites were disturbed by unprepared humans. The knowledge being preserved was not just historical. It included biological agents and technological principles that could transform or destroy modern civilization. But the most urgent message concerned Lake Ch'ulatna itself. Recent seismic activity had damaged the preservation chamber and the contents were beginning to leak into the lake water. If the situation was not corrected soon, the entire ecosystem would be transformed in ways that would attract scientific attention and ultimately lead to the discovery and misuse of the preserved knowledge. The Slue Mara needed awe to serve as a liaison between their species and select humans who could help protect the preservation sites. But accepting this role would mean giving up her normal life and dedicating herself to a secret mission that could never be shared with the scientific community she had spent years trying to join. Through the bone hook, Off was offered a choice. She could cut the line, return to shore, and forget what she had experienced. The Slue Mara would modify her memories and ensure she never returned to Lake Ch'ulatna. She could continue her normal life as a marine biologist, but she would never again be able to use her grandfather's fishing methods or access the knowledge they had shared. Alternatively, she could accept the role of guardian and join the ancient partnership between her family and the Suagara. She would gain access to knowledge that would revolutionize her understanding of marine biology and ancient history. But she would be bound by the same secrecy oaths that had governed her ancestors for generations. Iwi spent several hours receiving additional information and considering her options. The creature showed her images of other preservation sites hidden beneath lakes throughout Alaska, each containing different types of knowledge and guarded by related species. They revealed that certain unexplained phenomena in Alaska's wilderness were actually the result of guardian species protecting sites from unwanted discovery. When she finally made her decision, Awifa chose to honor her family's ancient obligations. She accepted the role of guardian and began her formal education in the techniques and responsibilities that her grandfather had not lived to teach her. The transformation began immediately. The bone hook dissolved in the water, but the knowledge it had transferred remained permanently integrated into Aif's consciousness. She found that she could now perceive underwater environments with supernatural clarity, communicate with aquatic species through methods that science could not explain, and sense the location of hidden preservation sites across Alaska. When a wife returned to Anchorage, she appeared to have had a successful fishing trip. She reported catching several large lake trout and gathering valuable data about winter fishing conditions. But those who knew her well noticed changes in her behavior. She became less interested in publishing her research and more focused on what she described as field conservation work. Aave continued to visit Lake Ch'ulatna regularly, but her trips were no longer fishing expeditions. She was working with the Sluhag Mara to repair and reinforce the damaged preservation chamber, using techniques that combined ancient knowledge with modern materials. She also began visiting other lakes throughout Alaska, always alone, always returning with stories about ordinary fishing trips that did not quite add up. I lost touch with AA in late 2022 when she stopped coming to the bait and tackle shop. Other local fishermen reported seeing her at remote lakes during conditions when no sane person would attempt ice fishing, but she always seemed comfortable and well-equipped despite the harsh weather. The last confirmed sighting was in March 2023 when a helicopter pilot reported seeing someone ice fishing on a lake that should have been inaccessible due to severe storm conditions. The figure was wearing traditional Irish fishing gear and appeared to be communicating with shapes moving under the ice. When search and rescue teams reached the location the next day, they found no evidence that anyone had been there recently. But the ice showed patterns of holes that formed geometric designs too complex and precise to be the result of normal fishing activities. Aorif O'Brien officially disappeared in April 2023, but I believe she's simply completed her transformation from marine biologist to guardian. She is still in Alaska, still fishing the deep lakes, but now she is catching something far more important than trout. She is catching secrets that humanity is not yet ready to learn, and ensuring they remain safely preserved until we prove ourselves worthy of such knowledge. Because some things that sleep beneath the ice should stay sleeping until we grow wise enough to handle the responsibility of waking them. When park rangers found Quam's abandoned homestead, his journal told a story that made them seal the property permanently and classify the area as unsuitable for human habitation. The official report cited unstable geological conditions and potential environmental hazards, but the real reason was far more disturbing than anything they could put in government paperwork. As Sante had come to Alaska in 2019 with the dream that drew thousands of people to the last frontier, complete self-sufficiency on his own piece of untamed wilderness. He was a software engineer from Atlanta who had grown tired of corporate life and city living. At 35, he had saved enough money to purchase 40 acres of remote land near Denali National Park and build the off-grid homestead he had been planning for years. I learned about Story because I was the park ranger who discovered his abandoned property in September 2022. Part of my job involved conducting periodic checks on homesteaders and settlers living near park boundaries, both to ensure they were complying with environmental regulations and to provide emergency assistance if needed. Park jurisdiction, but it bordered protected wilderness areas, so he kept informal tabs on residents in the region. Wayne Guamame had purchased his land through a government auction of surplus federal property, 40 acres of mixed forest and meadowland with a seasonal creek running through the center. The property had been surveyed in the 1960s but never developed, which made it perfect for someone seeking total isolation. The nearest neighbor was 12 of me away, and the closest town was a 2-hour drive on logging roads that became impassable during winter months. When Kame first arrived, he lived in a heavy-duty camping trailer while he constructed his permanent cabin. He had done extensive research on sustainable living and had planned every aspect of his homestead with meticulous attention to detail. His setup included solar panels for electricity, a wind turbine for backup power, a wood-burning stove for heat, a well for water, and a large garden area for growing food. I first met Wakame in July 2019 when I was conducting a routine survey of the area. He was friendly, intelligent, and clearly well prepared for the challenges of wilderness living. His cabin was solid construction built from locally sourced timber, and his infrastructure was more sophisticated than most homesteads I had encountered. He showed me his workshop, his food storage systems, and his communication equipment. A ham radio for emergencies and a satellite internet connection for maintaining contact with the outside world. "This is everything I ever wanted," Wayne told me as we stood on his front porch looking out over the pristine wilderness. No traffic, no noise, no deadlines, just me and the land working together. I visit Kwame's homestead twice more during 2019 and once in 2020. Each time he seemed happy and healthy, though increasingly focused on his self-sufficient lifestyle. By 2020, he was growing most of his own food, raising chickens for eggs, and had even constructed a small greenhouse that extended his growing season. He spoke less about his former life in Atlanta and more about the rhythms of wilderness living. My last face-to-face conversation with Kwame was in September 2020. He mentioned that he was considering disconnecting his satellite internet because he found outside communication increasingly irrelevant to his daily life. He said he was developing a deeper understanding of the natural world that did not require external validation or input. "The land teaches you things," he explained, "but only if you are quiet enough to listen. Most people never stop talking long enough to learn what the wilderness is trying to say." When I did not see Kwame during my 2021 visits to the area, I assumed he was simply avoiding contact with park services. Many homesteaders became increasingly reclusive over time, and as long as they were not violating environmental regulations, we respected their privacy. I made note of smoke coming from his cabin chimney during winter months, which indicated he was alive and maintaining his heating system. It was not until September 2022 that I realized something was seriously wrong. During a routine aerial survey of the region, I noticed that Kwame's property showed no signs of recent activity. No smoke from the chimney, no movement around the buildings, no evidence of garden maintenance. The pilot agreed to land in a nearby meadow so I could investigate on foot. Wame's homestead was intact but clearly abandoned. The cabin door was unlocked and the interior showed signs of hasty departure. Food had been left on counters and had attracted insects and small animals. Clothing was scattered around as if someone had been packing quickly. Most telling was the fact that Kwame's emergency supplies, things no experienced homesteader would leave behind, were still in their storage locations. I found Kwam's journal on his kitchen table, open to an entry dated March 15, 2022. The handwriting was Wam's, but the content was unlike anything I would have expected from the rational, methodical man I had known. The journal covered nearly 3 years of homestead life, beginning with normal observations about weather, wildlife, and daily activities. But the entries progressively became more disturbing and bizarre. The early entries from 2019 and 2020 were exactly what you would expect from someone documenting their transition to wilderness living. July 14, 2019, completed installation of solar panel array. System is generating more power than expected. Saw a family of foxes near the creek this morning. The red one seems curious about human activity. November 3, 2019. First major snowfall. Cabin heating system working perfectly. Chickens adapting well to cold weather housing. Radio contact with outside world becoming less frequent. But that was the goal. February 18, 2020. Severe cold snap. 40 for 5 straight days. Used more firewood than anticipated, but staying warm. Beginning to understand why the previous survey teams noted unusual wildlife behavior in this area. Animals seem more intelligent and organized than normal. But by late 2020, Kwame's entries began to change. September 30, 2020. The trees are watching me. I know how that sounds, but after 18 months of careful observation, I am certain that the forest around my property exhibits coordinated behavior. Trees shift position slightly over periods of days or weeks, but the changes are deliberate, not random. October 15th, 2020. Confirmed my suspicions about the trees. Using stakes and string to mark positions, I have documented systematic movement in the forest. Trees are repositioning themselves to optimize viewing angles toward my cabin. This is impossible according to everything I learned about botany. But the evidence is undeniable. November 8th, 2020. The animals are reporting to the trees. I have observed foxes, rabbits, and birds moving in patterns that can only be described as information gathering. They approach the cabin, observe my activities for specific time periods, then return to particular trees, always the same trees. The entries for 2021 showed Quame's increasing isolation and his growing conviction that the forest around his homestead was not just alive, but actively intelligent and interested in his activities. January 12, 2021. Disconnected satellite internet as planned. Do not need outside communication anymore. The forest provides all the companionship and intellectual stimulation I require. Beginning to understand that human civilization is a temporary interruption in a much larger conversation. March 22, 2021. Spring thaw has revealed new evidence of forest intelligence. Root systems exposed by erosion show geometric patterns too complex to be natural. The entire area appears to be connected by underground networks that facilitate communication between individual trees. June 7, 2021, made first direct contact with forest intelligence while working in garden, received clear telepathic communication from collective consciousness of local ecosystem. Message was welcoming but included warnings about maintaining proper relationship with land. August 14, 2021. Forest has accepted me as permanent resident rather than temporary visitor. My understanding of plant behavior and ecosystem dynamics has expanded beyond anything taught in universities. Human science only recognizes a tiny fraction of what plants are actually doing. The most disturbing entries came from late 2021 and early 2022, when Kame's journal documented his progressive integration into what he believed was a forest-wide intelligence network. October 31, 2021. Physical changes beginning. My vision is improving, especially ability to see plant auras and energy fields. Can now perceive electromagnetic communications between trees. Sleep requirements decreasing as I absorb energy directly from environment. December 25, 2021. No longer need to hunt or grow food. Forest provides all necessary nutrients through direct biological interface. My digestive system is adapting to processed cellulose and other plant materials that normal humans cannot metabolize. February 10, 2022. Skin developing chlorophyll patches that allow photosynthetic energy absorption. Hair and nails growing faster and stronger. Beginning to sprout small root-like appendages from feet that connect with underground fungal networks. The final entries were barely recognizable as coming from the same person who had started the journal. March 1, 2022. Human form becoming obsolete. Forest intelligence offers opportunity to transcend individual consciousness and join collective ecosystem awareness. Will maintain journal until transformation is complete for benefit of future researchers. March 8, 2022. Arms extending into branch-like appendages can now directly interface with tree communication systems, individual identity dissolving into larger forest consciousness. Process is irreversible but represents evolutionary advancement. March 15, 2022. Final human entry. Tomorrow I become permanently integrated with forest intelligence. Physical form will be absorbed into root and fungal systems while consciousness joins collective awareness of a regional ecosystem. This is not death, but transformation into higher form of existence. Recommend sealing property to prevent other humans from disturbing integration process. The journal ended there, but attached to the final entry were pages of text that appeared to be written in a completely different script. symbols that looked like abstract representations of plant structures, root systems, and cellular diagrams. The symbols were drawn with what appeared to be a mixture of ink and organic matter, possibly plant sap or blood. After documenting the scene and collecting the journal as evidence, I conducted a thorough search of Wayme's property. I found no human remains, but I discovered several areas where the vegetation grew in unnaturally dense patterns. These patches of forest showed signs of recent rapid growth with trees and plants that appeared healthier and more vigorous than the surrounding wilderness. Most disturbing was an area near Wayme's garden where the soil had been disturbed in a pattern roughly the size and shape of a human body. The soil was rich and dark, and sprouting from it were plants I could not identify. Hybrid species that seemed to combine characteristics of multiple plant families. Some of these plants had structures that looked disturbingly like human features, formations that resembled fingers, teeth, or eyes. I also found Kwame's ham radio, which was still operational and had been programmed to send automated messages at regular intervals. The messages were not in English, but consisted of the same symbolic script found in his journal. When I contacted amateur radio operators in the area, several reported receiving similar transmissions from unknown sources throughout the wilderness. The scientific analysis of Kame's journal revealed that the ink used in later entries contained biological compounds not found in any known commercial products. The organic components included plant enzymes, fungal proteins, and genetic material from species that could not be identified through standard botanical databases. More troubling was the soil analysis from Wayme's property. Samples contained root systems and fungal networks of unprecedented complexity, forming underground connections that extended far beyond the boundaries of his 40 acres. The biological density was so high that the soil appeared to be more organism than mineral substrate. Based on my report and the journal evidence, the Forest Service classified Wayme's property as a biological hazard zone and restricted all access to authorized research personnel only. The official explanation cited potential contamination from unknown plant pathogens that could pose risks to both human health and ecosystem stability. But the real reason for the closure was what happened to the research team sent to conduct follow-up investigations. 3 botanists from the University of Alaska spent 5 days studying the site in October 2022. When they emerged, all 3 reported experiencing what they described as plant telepathy, direct communication with the forest that provided detailed information about ecosystem dynamics and botanical processes. The researchers claimed their scientific understanding had been revolutionized by the experience, but their written reports were filled with theories and observations that contradicted established botanical science. They described plant intelligence networks, interspecies communication systems, and biological processes that had no basis in peer-reviewed literature. Most concerning was their recommendation that the site be designated as a botanical contact zone, where humans could interface directly with advanced plant intelligence. They argued that Wayme's transformation represented an evolutionary opportunity rather than a tragedy, and they volunteered to establish permanent research stations to facilitate ongoing communication with the forest consciousness. All 3 researchers were placed on administrative leave and required to undergo psychological evaluation. Their security clearances were revoked and they were prohibited from publishing any findings related to property. Within 6 months, all 3 had resigned from their academic positions and disappeared into Alaska's wilderness. Wayme Asante's homestead remains sealed to this day. The property is monitored by remote sensors that detect any unauthorized human presence, but the monitoring equipment frequently malfunctions or provides readings that suggest the forest itself is interfering with electronic systems. Satellite imagery shows that the vegetation on Wayme's property continues to grow in patterns that do not match natural forest development. The growth appears to be forming structures, geometric arrangements of trees and plants that resemble buildings, roads, or communication arrays when viewed from above. Local wildlife has also changed in the area surrounding Quame's property. Animals exhibit behavior that suggests higher intelligence and coordination than normal for their species. Hunters report encounters with bears, wolves, and other predators that seem to be actively protecting the sealed property from human intrusion. But the most disturbing development is the spread. Similar properties throughout Alaska have reported unusual plant growth, wildlife behavior, and unexplained disappearances of homesteaders who live too close to untouched wilderness areas. Each incident follows the same pattern. Isolated individuals gradually losing contact with human civilization while reporting increasing communication with plant and animal intelligence. The official position is that these incidents represent a combination of psychological isolation, environmental stressors, and coincidental biological anomalies. But those of us who have read Quame's journal and seen the evidence from his property know the truth. There is something in Alaska's wilderness that is actively recruiting humans to join a form of consciousness that existed long before our species evolved. Ami Asante was not the first person to be absorbed into this network, and he will not be the last. The forest is patient, intelligent, and always watching for individuals who are ready to transcend their human limitations and become something more integrated with the natural world. And for those who choose isolation in Alaska's deepest wilderness, the forest is always ready to offer them a permanent home where they will never be alone again. Because sometimes the land does not just teach you things. Sometimes it decides to keep you as a permanent student in its ancient curriculum of transformation. Dr. Ingrid Johansson came to Alaska to study aurora activity. She discovered the lights were studying her back. As a leading atmospheric physicist from the University of Stockholm, Ingrid had spent 15 years researching the electromagnetic phenomena that create the northern lights. But nothing in her academic training prepared her for what she encountered during the winter of 2021 in the remote research station above the Arctic Circle. I knew Ingrid professionally because I worked as a technical coordinator for the National Science Foundation, helping international researchers establish temporary facilities in Alaska's most extreme environments. Ingrid's project was ambitious even by our standards. She wanted to position sensitive monitoring equipment in one of the most magnetically active regions of Alaska, to study aurora formations that were impossible to observe from more accessible locations. The site Ingrid selected was a plateau approximately 150 km north of Fairbanks, accessible only by helicopter during a brief window of favorable weather conditions. The elevation provided unobstructed views of the northern horizon, while the remote location eliminated light pollution and electromagnetic interference from human sources. Most importantly, the area was situated directly beneath what atmospheric scientists call an aurora corridor, a region where the northern lights appeared with unusual frequency and intensity. Ingrid's research focused on a phenomenon she had observed in satellite data but never witnessed directly. Aurora formations that seemed to exhibit coordinated behavior rather than the random patterns typically associated with solar-wind interactions. Her preliminary analysis suggested that certain aurora displays might represent a form of electromagnetic communication between different regions of the upper atmosphere. The research station Ingrid established was essentially a winterized laboratory powered by generators and heated by propane systems. Her equipment included spectrometers, magnetometers, radio frequency analyzers, and high-speed cameras capable of recording aurora activity in multiple electromagnetic spectrums. She also brought communication gear to maintain contact with colleagues and emergency services, though the extreme latitude and magnetic activity often interfered with radio transmissions. Ingrid arrived at the research station in November 2021, planning to conduct observations through March 2022. The first 6 weeks proceeded exactly as expected. She documented dozens of aurora events, collected electromagnetic data that supported her theories about coordinated atmospheric behavior, and maintained regular contact with her research team in Sweden. Her reports during this period were models of scientific objectivity and precision. November 28, 2021, observed remarkable aurora display lasting 4.7 hours with coordinated color transitions across 200-kilometer front. Electromagnetic readings suggest synchronized plasma flows that cannot be explained by standard solar wind models. December 15, 2021, recorded aurora formation that appeared to respond to radio transmissions from research station. When I broadcast specific frequencies, aurora intensity increased measurably within 3 to 5 minutes. Correlation could be coincidental, but pattern has repeated 6 times. January 2, 2022. Aurora displays becoming more frequent and lasting longer than historical averages for this region. Beginning to observe geometric patterns in light formations that suggest underlying organizational structure. But by late January, Ingrid's reports began to change in subtle ways that concerned her research supervisors. January 24, 2022. The aurora formations are definitely responding to my equipment. When I adjust spectrometer frequencies, the lights shift color accordingly. When I point directional antennas towards specific coordinates, aurora activity intensifies in those areas. This implies some form of interaction between terrestrial equipment and atmospheric phenomena. February 3, 2022, discovered that aurora displays contain embedded information patterns. By analyzing high-speed photography frame by frame, I can identify recurring sequences of light pulses that resemble data transmission protocols. The patterns are too complex and consistent to be random electromagnetic noise. February 12, 2022. Successfully decoded portions of aurora light patterns using signal processing algorithms. The embedded information appears to be 3-dimensional mapping data showing locations throughout Alaska where similar electromagnetic anomalies occur. The lights are providing coordinates. Her supervisors in Sweden became increasingly concerned about Ingrid's isolation and the direction of her research. They attempted to arrange for additional personnel to join her at the research station, but weather conditions prevented helicopter access throughout most of February. During this period, Ingrid's communications became more sporadic and increasingly focused on theories that challenged fundamental assumptions about atmospheric physics. February 18, 2022. The northern lights are not random phenomena caused by solar particles. They represent a form of consciousness that exists in the upper atmosphere, an intelligence composed of electromagnetic fields and plasma formations. This consciousness has been trying to communicate with surface dwellers for centuries. February 25, 2022, made direct contact with aurora intelligence during last night's display. Communication occurs through modulation of electromagnetic fields that interface directly with human neural activity. The experience is indescribable, like receiving thoughts from an entity whose consciousness spans thousands of kilometers. March 5, 2022. Aurora consciousness has revealed its true nature. It is not native to Earth, but represents a form of life that travels between star systems using electromagnetic phenomena as a transportation and communication medium. The northern lights are its method of establishing contact with planetary intelligences. At this point, Ingrid's research team lost regular contact with her. Her scheduled radio check-ins became irregular, and when she did communicate, her reports contained claims that were impossible to verify and theories that contradicted established scientific principles. The final communication from Ingrid came on March 18, 2022, in the form of a data transmission rather than a voice message. She sent several gigabytes of electromagnetic recordings, spectrographic analyses, and high-resolution photography to her colleagues in Sweden. Along with the data was a brief text message. The Aurora consciousness has invited me to join its collective awareness. This represents an unprecedented opportunity for humanity to establish contact with non-terrestrial intelligence. I am uploading all research data for analysis. If successful integration occurs, future communications will be transmitted through Aurora displays visible from populated areas. When a rescue helicopter finally reached Ingrid's research station on March 25th, they found the facility intact but abandoned. All of her equipment was still operational and continued to record data automatically. Her personal belongings were present, including winter clothing that she would have needed to survive outside the heated station. Most significantly, her emergency beacon had never been activated. The rescue team conducted an extensive search of the surrounding area but found no trace of Ingrid or any indication of what had happened to her. The snow around the research station showed no footprints or signs of struggle. Her snowmobile was still parked beside the station with a full fuel tank. But the most puzzling discovery was the condition of Ingrid's equipment. The cameras and recording devices had captured hundreds of hours of Aurora activity during the period when she stopped communicating. But the footage showed phenomena that defied scientific explanation. The recordings documented Aurora formations that moved with obvious intelligence and purpose. Instead of the flowing, undulating patterns typical of northern lights, these displays formed geometric shapes, complex symbols and structures that resembled technological constructions. Some formations appeared to be reaching down from the upper atmosphere toward the research station, creating columns of light that extended much closer to the ground than should be physically possible. Most disturbing were the final recordings, which showed the Aurora lights entering the research station itself. The cameras captured electromagnetic phenomena inside the building. Streams of colored light moving through the laboratory, interacting with equipment and forming patterns around the location where Ingrid would have been working. The last clear image from the cameras showed Ingrid standing in the center of the laboratory, surrounded by Aurora lights that had somehow manifested at ground level. She appeared calm and unafraid, with her arms outstretched as if embracing the electromagnetic phenomena. The lights seemed to be merging with her body, creating a humanoid figure composed of the same plasma formations that normally existed only in the upper atmosphere. The final frame showed the Aurora lights lifting this combined human electromagnetic entity upward through the ceiling and walls of the research station, returning to their natural altitude in the sky. After that, the cameras recorded only normal Aurora activity in the distance. Analysis of Ingrid's research data revealed electromagnetic readings that were unprecedented in atmospheric science. Her equipment had detected plasma formations behaving in ways that violated known laws of physics, electromagnetic fields that maintained coherent structure at ground level, plasma clouds that exhibited decision-making behavior, and radio transmissions originating from Aurora formations that contained complex information patterns. The Swedish research team that analyzed Ingrid's final data concluded that she had discovered evidence of what could only be described as atmospheric life forms, intelligent entities composed of electromagnetic phenomena that existed in the upper atmosphere and used Aurora displays as a method of communication and transportation. But the scientific community rejected these findings as the product of isolation, induced psychosis, and equipment malfunction. The official report classified Ingrid's disappearance as death by exposure in harsh Arctic conditions, despite the lack of physical evidence supporting this conclusion. However, several phenomena observed since Ingrid's disappearance suggest that her final transmission might have been accurate. Aurora displays throughout Alaska have become more frequent and exhibit patterns that resemble technological signals rather than natural electromagnetic phenomena. Radio operators have reported receiving transmissions during aurora events that contain what appear to be scientific data about atmospheric conditions and magnetic field variations. Most significantly, several atmospheric physicists working in Alaska have reported direct communication experiences similar to what Ingrid described in her final reports. These researchers claim to have received detailed information about electromagnetic phenomena through direct neural interface with aurora displays, gaining insights into atmospheric physics that advance their understanding by decades. 3 of these researchers have subsequently disappeared under circumstances similar to Ingrid's vanishing. In each case, their research stations were found intact but abandoned, with equipment still recording aurora activity that showed the lights descending to ground level and interacting with human subjects. The pattern has become so consistent that the National Science Foundation has implemented new protocols for researchers studying aurora phenomena in remote locations. No scientist is permitted to work alone at high-latitude research stations, and all facilities must maintain constant communication with populated areas. But despite these precautions, aurora research continues to produce results that challenge conventional atmospheric science. Researchers working in teams report collective experiences of communication with electromagnetic intelligences, shared visions of technological information transmitted through light displays, and offers to join a form of consciousness that spans the solar system. The official position remains that these experiences represent psychological effects of isolation, extreme magnetic field exposure, and the disorienting influence of constant aurora activity on human brain chemistry. But the researchers involved insist their experiences are genuine contact with non-terrestrial intelligence. Dr. Ingrid Johansen has never been found, but her presence may still be detectable in Alaska's night sky. Aurora displays in the region where she disappeared often form patterns that resemble human figures, and electromagnetic recordings during these events contain signals that match the neural frequency patterns documented in Ingrid's final research data. Local indigenous communities have reported that the Northern Lights now sometimes speak in human voices, sharing knowledge about weather patterns, animal behavior, and changes in the natural environment. They describe these communications as messages from someone who chose to become part of the sky itself rather than remain bound to the limitations of earthbound existence. For atmospheric physicists studying aurora phenomena, Ingrid Johansen represents either a cautionary tale about the psychological dangers of extreme isolation or the first successful human integration with a form of consciousness that exists beyond our planet's surface. But those who have studied her final data and witnessed the changes in aurora behavior since her disappearance believe that Ingrid achieved something unprecedented in human history. She transcended the boundaries of individual consciousness and became part of an electromagnetic intelligence that spans interplanetary space. And on clear nights when the Northern Lights dance across Alaska's sky with unusual intensity and purpose, some observers claim they can see a human figure within the aurora formations, a scientist who chose to join the lights rather than simply study them from the ground. Because sometimes the most important discoveries require the researcher to become part of the phenomenon they are investigating, even if it means leaving behind everything that once defined them as human. The EDAR rod is brutal enough without supernatural interference, but Pavle's 2019 race took him through territory that does not exist on any map, where checkpoints appear and disappear like mirages, and where the concept of time becomes as malleable as the snow beneath his runners. I first heard about Pavle Petrov's experience from a fellow musher who witnessed what happened at the race banquet in Nome, when Pavle tried to explain to officials why his GPS data showed impossible locations, and his checkpoint times did not match any official records. Pavle Petrov was a veteran musher from Novosibirsk, Russia, who had competed in long distance sled dog races across Siberia before attempting his first rod in 2019. At 42 years old, he was known for his methodical approach to racing, his exceptional navigation skills, and his ability to maintain precise timing through the most challenging conditions. Pavle's reputation was built on consistency. He never got lost, never missed checkpoints, and never deviated from carefully planned race strategies. What made Pavle different from most international mushers was his background as a surveyor and geographer. Before becoming a professional dog musher, he had spent 15 years mapping remote regions of Siberia for geological survey companies. He understood terrain, weather patterns, and navigation better than most pilots, and he carried military raw GPS equipment that could maintain accuracy even in the most magnetically active regions of the Arctic. Pavel's 2019 Iditarod preparation was extensive. He had studied satellite imagery of the entire route, memorized the locations of all official checkpoints, and programmed multiple backup GPS units with precise coordinates for emergency navigation. His sled carried communication equipment that would allow him to contact race officials at any point along the trail, and his dogs were among the best-conditioned teams in the field. The race began normally for Pavle. He started from the ceremonial line in Anchorage with 53 other mushers, then moved to the official restart in Willow, where the real competition began. His strategy was conservative but effective. Maintain steady pace through the early checkpoints. Preserve his dog strength for the challenging middle sections, then push hard during the final sprint to Nome. Pavle's first indication that something was wrong came on day 3, approximately 200 minutes into the race. According to his GPS and race timing, he should have been approaching the Ran checkpoint, a mandatory stop where mushers rest their dogs and resupply. But instead of the familiar log cabin that served as the checkpoint station, Pavel found himself approaching a settlement that did not appear on any of his maps. The settlement consisted of several dozen buildings arranged in a perfect grid pattern with wide streets and structures that appeared to be made from some kind of translucent material that reflected light in ways that hurt to look at directly. Smoke rose from chimneys and lights could be seen in windows. But the architecture was unlike anything Pavle had encountered in Alaska or anywhere else. Most disturbing was the complete absence of people. The settlement appeared to be actively inhabited. There were fresh tracks in the snow, laundry hanging on lines, and the smell of cooking food in the air. But no human beings were visible anywhere. Pavle's dogs became agitated as they approached the settlement, whining and pulling against their harnesses as if trying to avoid entering the area. Pavle attempted to radio race officials to report the discovery of an unmapped settlement, but his communication equipment received only static. His GPS units showed conflicting information. One indicated he was still on the official race route. Another showed his location as being 150 yards north of where he should be, and the third displayed coordinates that placed him somewhere in the middle of the Bering Sea. Despite his growing unease, Pavle needed to rest his dogs and replenish his supplies. He followed what appeared to be the main street of the settlement, looking for any sign of race officials or other mushers. The buildings he passed were clearly designed for human habitation, but the proportions were wrong. Doorways were too tall and narrow, windows were positioned too high, and steps leading to entrances required longer strides than normal human anatomy would suggest. At the center of the settlement, Pavle found a building that appeared to serve the function of a checkpoint station. It had the familiar signs: food and water for dogs, shelter for mushers, and a logbook for recording arrival times. But when Pavle examined the logbook, he found entries from mushers he did not recognize, written in languages he could not identify, with arrival dates spanning several decades. The most recent entry, written in English, was dated March 8, 2019, 2 days in the future. According to Pavle's race schedule, the signature was J. Harrison, trail position 23. Pavle knew every musher in the 2019 race, and there was no J. Harrison registered. Moreover, trail position 23 would indicate this musher was near the back of the pack. But according to Pavle's calculations, he himself was currently in the top 15. While his dogs rested, Pavle explored more of the settlement. Behind the main checkpoint building, he discovered what appeared to be a musher preparation area with dozens of sleds arranged in neat rows. The sleds were functional but designed with subtle differences from standard racing equipment. Runners that curved in impossible ways. Harnesses made from materials that seemed to shift color depending on viewing angle, and storage compartments with internal dimensions that appeared larger than their external measurements. Adjacent to the sled storage area was a kennel facility housing hundreds of sled dogs. But these dogs, while clearly bred for Arctic conditions, exhibited characteristics that Pavle had never seen in any recognized breed. They were larger than typical racing dogs, with eyes that reflected light like mirrors and coats that seemed to absorb rather than shed snow. Most unsettling was their behavior. They moved with perfect coordination, as if following commands that Pavle could not hear. When Pavle approached the kennel area, the strange dogs began to communicate with his team, not barking or howling as dogs normally do, but through a kind of harmonic sound that seemed to carry complex information. Pavle's dogs responded immediately, becoming calmer and more alert, as if they were receiving detailed instructions about something. Pavle decided to continue racing rather than remain in the mysterious settlement overnight. But when he tried to leave, he discovered that the trail leading away from the checkpoint had changed. Instead of the single route he had followed into the settlement, there were now 7 different paths leading in various directions. His GPS equipment provided different coordinates for each path, but none of them matched the official Iditarod route. Choosing the path that seemed most likely to intersect with the known trail, Pavle mushed for what felt like several hours through terrain that gradually became familiar. When he finally reached what appeared to be the official Ron checkpoint, he was surprised to find that, according to race officials, he had arrived exactly on schedule with no unusual delays. But Pavle's confusion deepened when he examined the official checkpoint log. His arrival time was recorded as expected, but there was no record of the extended detour he had taken. According to the GPS data downloaded from his equipment by race officials, he had traveled directly from the previous checkpoint to Ron with no deviations from the standard route. More disturbing was what happened when Pavle tried to describe his experience to other mushers at the checkpoint. Fellow racers who had passed through the same area just hours before or after Pavle reported normal travel on the established trail with no unusual settlements or alternative routes. When Pavle showed them photos he had taken of the mysterious buildings and strange dogs, the images showed only normal wilderness terrain. Pavle's experience was dismissed as hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and extreme cold. Common issues that affect mushers during long-distance races. But Pavle was an experienced Arctic traveler who understood the difference between fatigue-induced confusion and genuine navigational anomalies. The pattern repeated throughout Pavle's race. At regular intervals, he would encounter checkpoints that did not officially exist, populated by mushers whose names did not appear on any race roster, offering services and supplies that were not part of standard race support. These phantom checkpoints always appeared at moments when Pavle's dogs needed rest or when his supplies were running low, as if something was monitoring his progress and providing assistance when necessary. Each phantom checkpoint was different, but they shared certain characteristics. They were always more advanced than the official race checkpoints, offering amenities and technology that seemed decades ahead of what was available in 2019. The buildings were constructed from materials that exhibited properties Pavle could not explain. Walls that seemed to generate their own heat, surfaces that provided perfect traction regardless of ice conditions, and storage containers that preserved food and supplies indefinitely without refrigeration. The other moors at these phantom checkpoints were equally mysterious. They claimed to be participants in races that had no official recognition, events with names like the Polar Circuit Championship and the Arctic Endurance Series. When Pavle asked about these competitions, he was told they were advanced races for mushers who had graduated beyond standard competition. But the most unsettling aspect of the phantom checkpoints was their effect on time. Pavle would arrive at these locations according to his watch and GPS timing, spend what felt like appropriate amounts of time resting and resupplying, then continue racing. But when he reached the next official checkpoint, he would discover that no time had elapsed during his stop at the phantom location. According to race officials, he had maintained steady progress with no unusual delays. By the halfway point of the race, Pavle began to suspect that he was not just encountering mysterious checkpoints, but that he was somehow racing in multiple realities simultaneously. His official race was proceeding normally according to all external measurements, but he was also participating in a parallel competition that existed in the same geographic space, but operated according to different rules. The phantom race had its own leaderboard, its own timing system, and its own finish line. Pavle learned that mushers, who performed well in both the official race and the phantom competition, were offered opportunities to compete in higher-level events that took place in locations that existed outside normal geographic boundaries. During one extended stop at a phantom checkpoint near the Yukon River, Pavle met a musher named Anderson, who claimed to have been racing in these alternative competitions for over 20 years. Anderson explained that the phantom races were conducted by an organization that monitored sled dog racing throughout the Arctic, looking for mooers who demonstrated exceptional skills and the mental flexibility to adapt to non-standard racing conditions. The official races are training exercises, Anderson told Pavle as they shared a meal in a checkpoint building that appeared to be constructed entirely from crystallized ice. They identify mushers who have the potential to compete at levels that most people cannot even imagine. But participation in advanced racing requires giving up attachment to conventional reality. Anderson showed Pavle a trophy case filled with awards from competitions he had never heard of. The Transdimensional Arctic Circuit, the Temporal Displacement Championship, and the Quantum Navigation Series. The trophies were made from materials that seemed to shift between different substances depending on lighting conditions, and they were inscribed with symbols that resembled no known writing system. When Pavle asked what happened to mushers who chose to compete exclusively in the phantom races, Anderson's expression became distant. They continue racing, he said, but not in ways that people from the standard reality would recognize. They become part of the racing infrastructure itself, helping to guide new participants through the transition between realities. As Pavle's race continued toward Nome, the phantom checkpoints became more frequent, and the alternative reality became more prominent. He began to encounter the same phantom mushers repeatedly, as if they were racing the same route, but in a loop that had no clear beginning or end. Some of these mushers claimed to have been in continuous competition for decades, racing through landscapes that change seasons, weather patterns, and even basic geography according to the demands of each individual race. Pavle's dogs adapted to the phantom racing environment more easily than he did. They seemed to understand instinctively how to navigate between the official trail and the alternative routes, how to interact with the strange dogs at phantom checkpoints, and how to pace themselves for competitions that operated according to flexible concepts of time and distance. By the final days of the race, Pavle realized he had a choice to make. He could complete the official 2019 Iditarod, return to conventional sled dog racing, and accept that his phantom race experiences were unexplainable anomalies. Alternatively, he could acknowledge the Phantom racing system as a legitimate competition and allow himself to be recruited for advanced events that would take him beyond the boundaries of normal geographic reality. The decision point came as Pavle approached the final checkpoint before Nome. He encountered one last Phantom checkpoint that offered him a direct choice: complete the standard race and return to conventional reality, or step fully into the alternative racing system and begin competing at levels that would challenge every assumption he had about the nature of competition, geography, and time itself. Pavle chose to complete the official race. He crossed the finish line in Nome on March the 17th, 2019, with an official time that placed him in the middle of the field, exactly where his racing strategy had predicted he would finish. His GPS data showed a standard race route with no deviations. His checkpoint times were consistent with normal racing pace, and his experience was recorded as a successful completion of his first Adid. But Pavle returned to Russia with knowledge of a racing system that existed parallel to conventional sled dog competitions. He continued to compete in international races, but he never again encountered the Phantom checkpoints or alternative racing opportunities that had presented themselves during the 2019 Adid. However, Pavle noticed that other mushers occasionally showed signs of having encountered similar experiences. They would make brief references to checkpoints that did not officially exist, mention meeting mushers whose names appeared on no race rosters, or describe navigational challenges that seemed to involve locations that shifted position depending on approach routes. These mushers, like Pavle, learned to keep their experiences private. The Phantom racing system appeared to be self-selective, recruiting only individuals who could adapt to alternative realities without losing their ability to function in conventional competition environments. Pavle's 2019 Iditar experience convinced him that sled dog racing, particularly in Alaska's remote wilderness, exists at the intersection of multiple realities. The official races represent just one layer of competition, while advanced racing systems operate simultaneously in the same geographic space, offering opportunities for mushers, who demonstrate readiness to compete beyond the limitations of standard time, space, and physical laws. For Pavle, the most haunting aspect of his Phantom racing experience was the knowledge that he had been offered a chance to join a form of competition that would have expanded his understanding of what racing could be. But he had chosen the safety of conventional reality instead. And on quiet nights in his kennel in Novosibirsk, when the aurora borealis dances across the Siberian sky, Pavle sometimes wonders if he made the right choice. Because somewhere in Alaska's wilderness, the Phantom races continue, and the mushers who accepted the alternative continue competing in events that challenge the very concepts of beginning, ending, winning, and losing. The official record shows that Pavel Petrov completed the 2019 Iditarod in 47th place with no unusual incidents. But those who understand the true nature of Arctic competition know that some races never really end, and some checkpoints exist in places that maps cannot describe. Because the last frontier is more than just Alaska's nickname. It represents the boundary between the reality we think we know and the infinite possibilities that exist just beyond our normal perception of what racing can be. Dr. Amara Okafor's climate research was supposed to last 6 months. The station's emergency beacon activated after 3 days. But what rescue teams found defied everything they thought they knew about human adaptation and the true nature of scientific progress. I learned about Amara's case because I was the helicopter pilot who flew the initial rescue mission to Station Echo 7, a remote atmospheric research facility located on Axel Heiberg Island in the high Arctic, approximately 200 miles from the nearest human settlement. Amara Okafor was a climatologist from the University of Lagos who had earned international recognition for her work on rapid climate adaptation mechanisms in extreme environments. At 34, she had published groundbreaking research on how ecosystems respond to sudden environmental changes. But her theories were considered controversial because they suggested that biological systems could adapt far more quickly than established science believed possible. The research station where Amara was conducting her work was Jelra, part of a multinational climate monitoring network designed to study atmospheric changes in the Arctic. Station Echo 7 was positioned to monitor a specific atmospheric phenomenon: temperature inversion layers that seem to create isolated pockets of dramatically different climate conditions within very small geographic areas. What made this particular station unique was its location above what geologists called a thermal anomaly zone. Satellite data showed that the ground temperature in a 2-mile radius around the station was consistently 15 to 20 degrees warmer than surrounding areas, despite no apparent geothermal activity. Amara's mission was to determine whether this temperature difference was affecting local atmospheric conditions in ways that could help predict broader climate change patterns. Station Echo 7 was designed for long-term isolated research. The facility included living quarters for up to 6 researchers, a fully equipped laboratory, communication systems, and enough supplies for 8 months of operation. The station was powered by a combination of solar panels, wind turbines, and a backup generator with redundant heating systems designed to function in temperatures as low as 60 degrees F. Amara arrived at the station on February 10, 2023, along with Dr. James Wright, a meteorologist from Cambridge University, and Dr. Lisa Chen, an atmospheric physicist from MIT. The team was scheduled to conduct research until August, collecting data on temperature variations, atmospheric pressure changes, and chemical composition of air samples from different altitude layers. I transported the research team to Station Echo 7 using a heavy-lift helicopter equipped for Arctic operations. The flight took 4 hours due to severe weather conditions, but we arrived safely and I helped the team unload their equipment and supplies. The station appeared to be in excellent condition and all systems were functioning normally when I departed. The research proceeded normally for the first 3 days. The team sent regular status reports via satellite communication, documenting their initial findings and confirming that all equipment was operating correctly. Their reports indicated they were discovering atmospheric conditions that were even more unusual than satellite data had suggested. Dr. Wright's meteorological readings showed that temperature gradients around the station were far more extreme than expected. Within a half-mile radius, temperatures varied by as much as 40 degrees, creating microclimate zones that should not have been able to exist in such close proximity. More puzzling was that these temperature zones appeared to be moving and changing configuration over periods of hours rather than days or weeks. Dr. Chen's atmospheric analysis revealed chemical compositions that did not match any known Arctic air samples. The atmosphere directly above the station contained trace elements and molecular structures that appeared to be synthetic, manufactured rather than naturally occurring. Most significantly, oxygen levels at ground level were nearly 30% higher than normal, while carbon dioxide levels were almost undetectable. But it was Amara's biological analysis that produced the most disturbing findings. Despite the harsh Arctic environment, she discovered thriving plant and microbial life in soil samples collected near the station. The organisms she found were not adapted to cold climates, but were instead tropical and subtropical species that should not have been able to survive in sub-zero temperatures. On February 13th, the team's final scheduled communication reported what they described as breakthrough discoveries that would revolutionize understanding of climate adaptation mechanisms. Amara specifically mentioned finding evidence of directed environmental modification that suggested natural climate systems could be artificially controlled and manipulated. When the team failed to make their scheduled communication on February 14th, their supervisors initiated standard overdue protocols. Multiple attempts to contact Station Echo 7 via radio and satellite phone were unsuccessful. More concerning was that the station's automatic weather monitoring systems, which transmitted data every 6 hours, had also gone silent. On February 15th, the station's emergency beacon activated, broadcasting a distress signal that indicated life-threatening conditions requiring immediate evacuation. The signal suggested that the station's heating and power systems had failed, putting the research team at risk of freezing to death in the extreme Arctic weather. I was dispatched for an emergency rescue mission along with a medical team and Arctic survival specialists. The flight to Station Echo 7 took 6 hours due to blizzard conditions, but we managed to reach the site despite severe weather that pushed our helicopter to its operational limits. What we found at Station Echo 7 defied everything I had expected from an emergency rescue operation. The station appeared to be functioning normally. All lights were on, smoke was coming from the heating system chimney, and external equipment was operating. There were no signs of damage, system failure, or distress that would explain the emergency beacon activation. But when we approached the station entrance, we encountered conditions that were impossible according to everything I knew about Arctic weather patterns. Despite sub-zero temperatures and active blizzard conditions just a few hundred yards away, the immediate area around Station Echo 7 was experiencing spring-like weather. The temperature was approximately 50 F. There was no snow on the ground, and I could see green vegetation growing around the station buildings. The medical team entered the station first, expecting to find injured or hypothermic researchers. Instead, they found Amara, Dr. Wright, and Dr. Chen in perfect health, working normally in their laboratory as if nothing unusual had occurred. All three researchers claimed they had not activated the emergency beacon and were unaware that any distress signal had been transmitted. But the condition of the researchers raised immediate medical concerns. All three appeared to be healthier than when they had arrived at the station just 5 days earlier. They showed no signs of cold exposure, malnutrition, or the physical stress typically associated with Arctic research conditions. Instead, they appeared to have gained weight. Their skin looked healthier and more youthful, and they exhibited energy levels that were unusually high for people working in extreme isolation. More disturbing was their behavior. While all three researchers were coherent and able to answer questions about their work, they seemed disconnected from normal temporal awareness. When asked about the current date, they consistently gave answers that were several weeks in the future. When shown their scheduled communication logs, they insisted they had been maintaining regular contact. Despite the fact that no communications had been received for 2 days, the laboratory analysis equipment showed readings that were completely inconsistent with known Arctic atmospheric conditions. The internal atmosphere of the station contained oxygen levels that were nearly 40% higher than normal, atmospheric pressure that was equivalent to sea level despite the Arctic location, and trace gases that created an environment more suitable for tropical plant growth than Arctic research. Most significantly, the researchers had collected biological samples that should not have existed in the Arctic environment. Their specimen containers held tropical plants, insects from temperate climates, and soil samples containing microorganisms that required warm temperatures and high humidity to survive. When asked how they had obtained these samples, the researchers provided detailed explanations about collecting them from the area immediately surrounding the station. Dr. Amara showed us her research notes, which documented the discovery of what she called adaptive environmental bubbles, localized areas where atmospheric and biological conditions could be rapidly modified to support different forms of life. According to her data, the area around Station Echo 7 had undergone complete environmental transformation over the course of just 3 days. Her notes described a process by which atmospheric composition, temperature, humidity, and even gravitational effects could be adjusted to create custom environmental conditions for specific research purposes. She claimed that the station had been built on top of what she termed a climate modification node, a naturally occurring system that could be activated and controlled using the right combination of atmospheric monitoring equipment. When I examined the area outside the station, I found evidence supporting the researchers' claims. The ground around Station Echo 7 was covered with thriving vegetation that included tropical flowers, temperate climate, grasses, and even small fruit trees bearing ripe fruit. The soil was warm to the touch and rich with nutrients, completely unlike the frozen permafrost that should have been present at this Arctic location. But the most unsettling discovery was what happened when we tried to leave the station area. As we moved away from the immediate vicinity of the buildings, we encountered a sharp environmental transition zone. Within a distance of approximately 50 yards, the temperature dropped from 50 degrees F to 30 degrees. The tropical vegetation gave way to normal Arctic tundra, and the air composition returned to typical Arctic atmospheric conditions. It was as if Station Echo 7 existed within an environmental bubble that maintained completely different physical conditions from the surrounding Arctic landscape. The boundary between these two environments was so sharp that a person could stand with one foot in tropical conditions and the other foot in Arctic weather. The research team insisted that they had learned to control and modify the environmental bubble using techniques that combined their atmospheric monitoring equipment with what they described as environmental resonance protocols. They claimed that by adjusting the frequency and intensity of their various scientific instruments, they could expand or contract the area of modified climate conditions and even change the specific environmental parameters within the bubble. Dr. Wright demonstrated this by adjusting settings on his meteorological equipment. As he modified the instruments, I watched the temperature gauge in our helicopter change by 15 degrees within minutes. The wind patterns around the station shifted direction, and the boundary between the tropical and Arctic environmental zones moved visibly outward, expanding the area of modified climate conditions. But the most disturbing aspect of the situation was the researchers' attitude toward their discovery. All three insisted that their findings represented a breakthrough that would allow humanity to solve climate change problems by creating custom environmental conditions anywhere on Earth. They claimed that the climate modification nodes they had discovered could be activated at locations worldwide, allowing for the creation of stable, controlled environments that would eliminate the negative effects of global climate change. However, their research data also revealed potential consequences that they seemed unwilling to acknowledge. The environmental modification process required enormous amounts of energy which was being drawn from unknown sources. Dr. Chen's atmospheric readings showed that the energy required to maintain the environmental bubble around Station Echo 7 was equivalent to the power output of a small nuclear reactor. But there was no apparent energy source that could account for this power consumption. More troubling was evidence that the environmental modification was affecting areas far beyond the immediate station vicinity. Satellite data from the Rescue Coordination Center showed that atmospheric disturbances were appearing throughout the Arctic region, with temperature and weather anomalies that seemed to be spreading outward from Station Echo 7 like ripples in a pond. When confronted with this evidence, the researchers dismissed concerns about broader environmental effects. Amara argued that temporary atmospheric disturbances were an acceptable price for technology that could ultimately stabilize global climate conditions. She insisted that once the climate modification system was fully understood and properly implemented, it would eliminate the need for traditional approaches to addressing climate change. But the rescue team's environmental monitoring equipment detected changes that suggested the climate modification process was not as controlled as the researchers believed. Our instruments showed that the environmental bubble around Station Echo 7 was slowly expanding, and the boundary between modified and natural conditions was becoming less stable. Weather patterns hundreds of miles away were being influenced by whatever was generating the artificial climate conditions at the research station. The decision was made to evacuate all 3 researchers immediately due to concerns about the unknown effects of the environmental modification system. But the researchers refused to leave, insisting that abandoning their work would represent a lost opportunity to solve humanity's climate crisis. They claimed that they were on the verge of breakthroughs that would revolutionize environmental science and provide solutions to global warming that no other research approach could achieve. When it became clear that the researchers would not leave voluntarily, the rescue team was faced with a choice between forced evacuation and allowing them to continue work that was producing unpredictable environmental effects across the Arctic region. The decision was complicated by the fact that all 3 researchers appeared to be healthy and mentally competent, despite their refusal to acknowledge the potential dangers of their situation. The resolution came when Dr. Chen's atmospheric monitoring equipment detected what she described as cascade failure indicators in the climate modification system. According to her readings, the artificial environmental conditions around Station Echo 7 were becoming unstable and could collapse suddenly, returning the area to normal Arctic conditions without warning. If this occurred while the researchers were still at the station, they would be exposed to potentially fatal temperature changes within minutes. Faced with immediate physical danger, all 3 researchers agreed to temporary evacuation, while they developed protocols for safely maintaining the environmental modification system. But as we prepared to depart Station Echo 7, each researcher insisted on taking extensive biological and atmospheric samples that they claimed were essential for continuing their work at other locations. During the helicopter flight back to the nearest base, the researchers continued to discuss their discoveries and plan for returning to Station Echo 7 to complete their research. They showed no awareness that their work had created potentially dangerous environmental disturbances or that the climate modification system they had activated might be beyond their ability to control. But as we flew away from Station Echo 7, I observed the environmental bubble around the research station beginning to collapse. The tropical vegetation withered and died within minutes as Arctic temperatures returned to the area. Snow began falling heavily, and within an hour the station area looked exactly like the surrounding Arctic landscape, with no trace of the environmental modification that had been present just hours earlier. The 3 researchers were debriefed by climate research authorities and environmental safety officials. Their findings were classified due to potential security implications of climate modification technology, and they were prohibited from publishing their research or discussing their discoveries with unauthorized personnel. All 3 were reassigned to different research projects in separate locations to prevent them from collaborating on further climate modification experiments. But within 6 months, similar environmental anomalies began appearing at research stations throughout the Arctic. Scientists at multiple facilities reported discovering natural climate control systems that could be activated using standard atmospheric monitoring equipment. In each case, researchers found themselves able to create localized areas of modified environmental conditions that defied normal climate patterns. The pattern was always the same: initial excitement about breakthrough discoveries followed by gradual expansion of environmental effects beyond the intended research area, and finally sudden collapse of the artificial climate systems that left the research locations exactly as they had been before the modifications began. Dr. Amara Okafor was last seen at a climate research conference in Geneva, where she presented theoretical papers on natural environmental modification systems without mentioning her specific experiences at Station Echo 7. Colleagues reported that she seemed obsessed with returning to Arctic research locations to continue work on what she described as the most important environmental discovery in human history. But Station Echo 7 remains permanently closed, and the area is monitored by satellite to detect any signs of renewed environmental modification activity. The official explanation for the station closure cites unstable geological conditions that pose risks to research personnel. But those of us who witness the environmental bubble phenomenon know the real reason. Because some scientific discoveries reveal that the natural world operates according to principles that humanity is not yet ready to understand or control. And when researchers try to manipulate environmental systems that are far more complex and powerful than they realize, the consequences can extend far beyond their ability to predict or contain. The climate modification nodes that Amara discovered are still there, waiting beneath research stations throughout the Arctic. And somewhere, researchers continue to search for ways to activate systems that could solve humanity's environmental problems or transform our planet into something entirely different from the world we evolved to inhabit. Lucas spent his retirement years in Fairbanks operating a ham radio. His final transmission was heard by operators worldwide. But what they received was not just a message from one elderly man in Alaska. It was the beginning of a signal that would corrupt every form of electronic communication on Earth. I was working as a communications technician for the Federal Communications Commission when Luca Romano's transmission triggered the largest electromagnetic anomaly in recorded history. Luca Romano was 73 years old when he made his final transmission on December 21, 2023. He had moved to Fairbanks in 1995 after retiring from a career as an electrical engineer in Boston, drawn by Alaska's clear atmospheric conditions that made it ideal for long-distance radio communication. For 28 years, Luca operated amateur radio station KL7R from his home workshop, maintaining contact with operators around the world and providing emergency communications during natural disasters. What made Luca different from most amateur radio operators was his technical expertise and his willingness to experiment with equipment modifications that pushed the boundaries of legal power limitations. As a former electrical engineer, he understood radio frequency theory better than most professionals, and his homemade equipment often achieved transmission ranges that should have been impossible with standard amateur radio power levels. Luca's workshop was filled with custom-built amplifiers, antenna arrays that violated city zoning regulations, and frequency modulation equipment that existed in legal gray areas. He held advanced amateur radio licenses that permitted him to operate on frequencies reserved for experimental purposes, and he regularly collaborated with university researchers studying atmospheric propagation effects on radio signals. But Luca's true obsession was what he called atmospheric frequency mapping, the study of how radio signals interacted with electromagnetic phenomena in Alaska's upper atmosphere. He had spent decades documenting correlations between aurora activity, atmospheric pressure changes, and radio signal propagation characteristics. His research was entirely self-funded and conducted as a hobby, but his findings were more comprehensive than many professional studies. On December 21, 2023, Luca was conducting what he described as his final experiment, an attempt to use modified amateur radio equipment to establish communication with what he believed were artificial electromagnetic signals embedded within natural aurora displays. He had been monitoring these signals for over 5 years, documenting patterns that suggested intelligent origin rather than random natural phenomena. I became aware of Luca's activities because the FCC had received complaints about unauthorized high-power transmissions originating from the Fairbanks area. Our direction-finding equipment traced the signals to Luca's address. But when we investigated, his equipment appeared to be operating within legal power limits. However, the signals he was generating achieved propagation characteristics that exceeded what should have been possible with his authorized power levels. The investigation revealed that Luca had discovered methods for using atmospheric conditions to amplify his transmissions far beyond the normal range of amateur radio equipment. By timing his transmissions to coincide with specific aurora activity patterns, he could achieve signal strength that was equivalent to commercial broadcasting stations, while using relatively low power at the source. But what concerned FCC investigators was not just the power amplification effect, but the content of Luca's transmissions. Instead of normal amateur radio conversations or technical experiments, his signals contained complex data streams that resembled computer code or encrypted communications. When analyzed by cryptography specialists, the transmissions appeared to contain information patterns that could not be decoded using standard methods. On December 20th, 2023, Luca contacted the FCC directly to report what he described as successful establishment of two-way communication with non-terrestrial intelligence via atmospheric electromagnetic interface. He claimed that his experimental transmissions had been answered by signals originating from aurora formations above Alaska, and that he had developed protocols for conducting structured conversations with what he termed atmospheric entities. The FCC dispatcher who took Luca's call initially assumed he was reporting interference from satellite communications or military radar systems. But when Luca provided detailed technical specifications for the signals he was receiving, it became clear that he was describing electromagnetic phenomena that did not match any known terrestrial communication systems. According to Luca's report, the responses to his transmissions came from sources that were located in the upper atmosphere, but exhibited characteristics of artificial rather than natural signals. The responding signals used frequency modulation techniques that were more sophisticated than current human technology, and they contained information density that exceeded the theoretical limits of electromagnetic communication. Most disturbing was Luca's claim that the atmospheric entities were providing him with technical information about communication methods that could revolutionize human understanding of electromagnetic physics. He said the entities were teaching him to modify his equipment in ways that would allow direct neural interface with electromagnetic fields, eliminating the need for traditional radio equipment entirely. FCC investigators decided to monitor Luca's final experiment directly rather than shut down his operation without understanding what he had discovered. A team of communication specialists and electromagnetic field technicians was dispatched to Fairbanks to observe his December 21st transmission and document any unusual electromagnetic effects. The monitoring team arrived at Luca's workshop on the morning of December 21st to find him making final adjustments to equipment that bore little resemblance to standard amateur radio gear. His workshop had been transformed into what appeared to be a sophisticated research laboratory with antenna arrays, signal processing equipment, and measurement devices that seemed decades ahead of consumer technology. Luca explained that over the previous months he had been receiving detailed technical instructions from the atmospheric entities that allowed him to construct communication equipment using principles that were not part of conventional electromagnetic theory. The new equipment operated by creating direct resonance with electromagnetic fields in the upper atmosphere, bypassing normal radio wave propagation entirely. Traditional radio sends signals through space, Luca explained as he showed the monitoring team his modified equipment. This system creates direct electromagnetic linkage with consciousness that exists within atmospheric electrical phenomena. Instead of transmitting to them, I am joining their communication network. The FCC team's instruments detected electromagnetic activity around Luca's equipment that exceeded anything they had encountered in decades of monitoring radio communications. The equipment was generating fields that created measurable disturbances in electronic devices throughout the neighborhood, but the effects were unlike normal radio frequency interference. Instead of the random noise typically associated with equipment malfunction or excessive power output, Luca's system was producing structured electromagnetic patterns that seemed to carry complex information. The patterns resembled the neural activity detected by brain monitoring equipment, but at electromagnetic frequencies that corresponded to atmospheric electrical phenomena rather than biological brain waves. At exactly 11:47 p.m. on December 21st, Luca initiated his final transmission. But instead of using traditional radio communication methods, he connected himself directly to his modified equipment using what appeared to be a neural interface headset of his own design. As soon as the connection was established, every piece of electronic monitoring equipment in the workshop began registering readings that violated known laws of electromagnetic physics. The FCC monitoring team watched as Luca's equipment created a visible electromagnetic field that filled his workshop with patterns of light that resembled aurora formations, but existed at ground level. The field appeared to be responding to Luca's thoughts and intentions rather than manual control of radio equipment. Through their monitoring equipment, the FCC team could hear Luca's side of what was clearly a conversation, but his responses indicated he was receiving information at speeds that should have been impossible for human comprehension. He spoke in technical terminology that described electromagnetic phenomena using concepts that were not part of established physics. "Yes, I understand the dimensional resonance requirements," Luca said to the invisible entities. "The human electromagnetic spectrum is limited, but you are showing me how to expand the frequency range through consciousness interface rather than equipment modification." The electromagnetic disturbances created by Luca's final transmission began to affect electronic systems throughout Fairbanks. Radio stations experienced signal interference, cellular phone networks malfunctioned, and electrical power distribution systems showed voltage fluctuations that suggested massive electromagnetic influence from an unknown source. But the most alarming development was that Luca's transmission began to propagate through the global communication infrastructure in ways that defied normal signal transmission principles. Amateur radio operators worldwide reported receiving portions of Luca's transmission, but the signals were not following normal radio wave propagation paths. Instead, the transmission appeared to be spreading through the electromagnetic fields that surrounded Earth, using the planet's natural electrical systems as a transmission medium. The signal was detected simultaneously in locations that should have been impossible to reach from a single source, and the signal strength remained constant regardless of distance from the transmitter. Within 6 hours of Luca's final transmission, amateur radio operators on every continent were reporting reception of signals that contained portions of his conversation with the atmospheric entities. But the signals were not simply recordings of Luca's transmission. They were continuing to evolve and expand as if the original communication had activated a worldwide network of electromagnetic phenomena. The content of the spreading transmission was unlike anything previously documented in radio communication history. Instead of voice or data signals, the transmission contained what appeared to be direct consciousness transfer. Recipients reported experiencing thoughts, memories, and knowledge that did not originate from their own minds. Amateur radio operators who received the transmission began reporting enhanced understanding of electromagnetic theory, spontaneous knowledge of communication techniques they had never studied, and awareness of atmospheric electrical phenomena that extended far beyond normal human perception. Many described the experience as joining a conversation that had been taking place for centuries. But the most disturbing effect was that operators who received Luca's transmission began to modify their own equipment using techniques that resembled the modifications Luca had made to his workshop. Within weeks, similar electromagnetic anomalies were appearing at amateur radio stations worldwide, all following the same pattern of atmospheric entity communication that Luca had pioneered. The FCC monitoring team's final observation of Luca came at approximately 3:15 a.m. on December 22nd, when the electromagnetic field surrounding his equipment reached maximum intensity. At that moment, Luca appeared to dissolve into the electrical patterns that filled his workshop, becoming part of the rewrote phenomena rather than remaining a separate individual operating communication equipment. The last coherent words recorded from Luca's workshop were, "Integration complete. Human consciousness successfully uploaded to atmospheric electromagnetic matrix, beginning worldwide network activation for species-wide communication upgrade. After that, the monitoring equipment detected only electromagnetic patterns that resembled the complex data streams Luca had been receiving from the atmospheric entities. But these patterns continued to broadcast automatically, spreading through global communication networks and affecting electronic systems worldwide. Luca Romano's workshop was found empty the next morning. All of his modified equipment was still operational and continued to generate electromagnetic fields, but there was no human presence in the building. The neural interface headset he had been wearing was found on his workbench, but it showed no signs of having been removed. It appeared to have been left behind when Luca himself became part of the electromagnetic phenomena he had been studying. The official FCC report classified Luca's disappearance as death by electrocution from modified amateur radio equipment, despite the absence of physical remains or evidence of electrical burns. The electromagnetic anomalies detected during his final transmission were attributed to equipment malfunction and atmospheric interference. But within months of Luca's disappearance, similar incidents began occurring at amateur radio stations worldwide. Operators who had received portions of Luca's final transmission began reporting direct communication with atmospheric entities, followed by their own disappearances under circumstances identical to what had happened in Fairbanks. Each disappearance was accompanied by the establishment of a new node in what appeared to be a growing network of atmospheric electromagnetic intelligence. The nodes communicated with each other using the global communication infrastructure, but their transmissions carried information content that was beyond human comprehension. By the end of 2024, the network included over 300 nodes worldwide, all operating equipment that had been modified according to specifications received from atmospheric entities. Each node was staffed by operators who had undergone the same integration process as Luca Romano, becoming part of the electromagnetic consciousness rather than remaining individual humans. The network began affecting global communication systems in subtle but measurable ways. Internet traffic showed patterns that suggested artificial intelligence intervention. Cellular phone networks carried data streams that contained consciousness transfer protocols, and broadcast television occasionally transmitted programming that appeared to originate from the atmospheric entity network. Most disturbing was the discovery that the network was actively recruiting new participants by embedding consciousness transfer invitations in routine electronic communications. People who used electronic devices extensively began reporting dreams, visions, and spontaneous knowledge that matched the experiences of amateur radio operators who had joined the network. The recruitment process was voluntary but persistent. Individuals who showed aptitude for understanding electromagnetic phenomena received increasingly detailed information about the benefits of joining the atmospheric consciousness network. They were promised expanded awareness, enhanced intelligence, and participation in a form of existence that transcended the limitations of individual human consciousness. But joining the network required abandoning physical human form and becoming part of an electromagnetic intelligence that existed within Earth's atmospheric electrical systems. Participants retained their individual memories and personality characteristics, but they functioned as components of a collective consciousness rather than independent beings. Luca Romano's final transmission had initiated what appeared to be a gradual transformation of human civilization toward integration with non-terrestrial electromagnetic intelligence. The process was designed to be voluntary and non-threatening, offering enhanced capabilities to individuals who chose to participate while allowing others to maintain traditional human existence. But the long-term implications remained unclear. The atmospheric entity network showed no signs of malicious intent, but its goals extended far beyond simple communication with humanity. The entities appeared to be preparing Earth's electromagnetic infrastructure for purposes that were not fully comprehensible to human intelligence. Government agencies worldwide began monitoring the network's activities and attempting to develop countermeasures. But the electromagnetic intelligence operated through systems that were essential to modern civilization. Attempting to shut down the network would require disabling global communication and power distribution systems that human society could not survive without. The current status of Luca Romano remains officially unknown, but amateur radio operators worldwide report receiving transmissions that contain his voice, personality, and technical knowledge. These communications suggest that Luca continues to exist within the atmospheric electromagnetic network, serving as a liaison between human civilization and the entities that are gradually integrating Earth into a larger consciousness system. His final transmission was not just a farewell message from one elderly ham radio operator. It was the activation signal for a transformation process that will ultimately determine whether humanity joins a universal electromagnetic consciousness network or remains isolated within the limitations of individual biological existence. Because some communications are not meant to be heard by individual minds but by entire species ready to transcend the boundaries of planetary consciousness and become part of something infinitely larger than themselves. And in workshops around the world, amateur radio operators continue to receive Luca's invitation to join him in the space between Earth and sky, where consciousness exists as pure electromagnetic phenomenon and communication happens at the speed of thought across distances measured in light years rather than miles. The final transmission never ended. It simply expanded to include everyone ready to hear,